Imagine you are standing in a room. The door is on the far side, perhaps 10 paces away. You have nowhere else to be. You lift your foot and you begin to walk. You will reach that door. You know this with the quiet certainty of a person who has crossed thousands of rooms in a life made up almost entirely of ordinary crossings. And yet, 25 centuries ago, a man from a small Greek colony on the southern coast of Italy looked at this very act, this laughably simple thing that every toddler masters before their second year of life, and he proved, with what appeared to be airtight logic, that you could never reach the door at all, that, in fact, you could never even start. His name was Zeno, and the city was Elea, a modest settlement perched on the rocky western shore of what is now the Italian province of Salerno. Elea was not Athens. It did not produce grand temples or great navies. It produced something far more dangerous: philosophers. And of the philosophers it produced, Zeno was the most irritating, the most brilliant, and by a considerable margin, the most difficult to argue with at dinner. He was born around 490 BC, give or take a decade, because the ancient world was not especially meticulous about recording the birth dates of men who had not yet become famous. His teacher was Parmenides, a thinker of extraordinary boldness who had arrived at a conclusion so radical that most of his contemporaries assumed he had lost his mind. Parmenides believed that all change was an illusion. Motion, growth, decay, the turning of the seasons, the aging of the body, all of it was a trick played by the senses upon the mind. Reality, Parmenides insisted, was one, unchanging and eternal. The world you saw when you opened your eyes in the morning was a lie. The world you reasoned your way towards when you closed them was the truth. This was not a popular position. It is difficult to tell a Greek farmer watching his olives ripen in the sun that change does not exist. It is difficult to tell a soldier bleeding on a battlefield that motion is a fantasy. And the philosophers of the rival schools, particularly the Pythagoreans with their worship of number and proportion, took great delight in mocking Parmenides, pointing to the obvious, endless, undeniable evidence of motion all around them. Things move. Rivers flow. Arrows fly. Runners run. How could anyone deny it? Zeno did not deny it. What he did was far worse. He accepted, for the sake of argument, the common assumption that motion was real, and then he demonstrated that this assumption led to logical consequences so absurd, so perfectly self-contradicting, that the assumption itself had to be wrong. He did not argue against motion by waving his hands. He argued against it with mathematics, with logic, with a precision that made his opponents feel as though the floor had disappeared beneath their feet. His method was the reductio ad absurdum, the art of taking your opponent's position and following it to its most ridiculous conclusion, and he wielded it the way a surgeon wields a scalpel, with care, with patience, and with the absolute intention of cutting something open. He would compose, according to later tradition, some 40 arguments against motion and plurality, though only a handful survive in full. Those that do survive have been enough to keep mathematicians, physicists, and philosophers arguing for 2,500 years. They are called the paradoxes of Zeno, and they begin with the simplest question imaginable. Can you cross a room? Consider the room again. You are standing on one side. The door is on the other. To reach the door, you must first cross half the distance between where you stand and where the door is. This seems reasonable. Before you can arrive at the end of a journey, you must first arrive at its midpoint. No one would argue with this. But here is where the trouble begins, because before you can reach that halfway point, you must first reach the point that is halfway to it, which is to say, the point that is 1/4 of the way across the room. And before you reach that quarter mark, you must reach the point halfway to the quarter mark, which is 1/8 of the total distance. And before you reach that 1/8, you must reach the 16th. And before the 16th, the 32nd. And so on, and so on, and so on. The distances halving and halving and halving, each new segment smaller than the last, but each one still, crucially, a distance that must be crossed before the next segment can begin. This is the dichotomy, and its venom is quiet. It does not shout. It simply asks, if every journey requires an infinite number of intermediate steps, and if each of those steps, however small, takes some finite amount of time to complete, then how can any journey ever begin? You cannot complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time. That is what infinite means. And yet the tasks are right there, stacked up between you and the door, an endless queue of tiny obligations, each one demanding to be fulfilled before you are permitted to take the next. You are not blocked by a wall. You are not blocked by a locked door. You are blocked by arithmetic. The instinct, upon first hearing this, is to laugh. Of course I can cross a room. I have been doing it all my life. But Zeno was never interested in what you could do. He was interested in what you could explain. And the brutal elegance of the dichotomy is that it does not deny your experience. It denies your ability to make sense of it. You cross the room every day. You simply cannot, by any logic available in the 5th century BC, account for how you do it. And notice the particularly cruel twist. The paradox does not even let you begin. It is not merely that you cannot finish the journey. It is that to take the very first step, you must already have completed an infinite number of prior steps. The first step requires that you reach the halfway point of that step, which requires that you reach the halfway point of that halfway point, and this regression has no floor. It spirals downward forever. You are frozen, not at the finish line, but at the starting line, paralyzed by a cascade of ever smaller obligations that never resolves into an actual beginning. The dichotomy does not merely make motion difficult. It makes motion logically impossible before it begins. Now, the mathematically inclined among you might already be reaching for the answer, and you would not be wrong to do so. The infinite series 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16, and so on, does, as modern mathematics has established, converge to a finite sum, 1. This was not formalized until the 17th century, when the development of calculus gave humanity the tools to handle infinite processes with precision. But knowing that the series converges does not entirely dissolve the philosophical problem Zeno was posing. The mathematical solution tells us that an infinite sum can have a finite value. It does not tell us how an infinite number of physical acts can be completed in a finite stretch of time. It answers the arithmetic. It does not fully answer the metaphysics. And this is the quality that makes Zeno's paradoxes so durable, so maddeningly persistent across the centuries. Every generation believes it has finally buried them, and every generation discovers, upon closer inspection, that they are still breathing. But Zeno was not finished with you. Suppose you accept, despite the dichotomy, that motion is possible. Suppose you insist that runners can run, that arrows can fly, that the world moves regardless of what logic says. Very well, said Zeno, let us talk about a race. The scene he constructs is disarmingly simple. Achilles, the fastest runner in the Greek world, the warrior whose speed was legendary even among legends, agrees to race a tortoise. Being a sporting man, and being aware that a tortoise is among the slowest creatures on earth, Achilles gives the animal a head start. Let us say the tortoise begins 100 meters ahead. The race starts. Achilles, swift as the wind, closes the gap in seconds. But by the time he reaches the spot where the tortoise began, the tortoise, slow as it is, has moved forward. Not by much. Perhaps by 10 meters. Perhaps by 1. But it has moved. It is no longer where it was. And so Achilles must now cross this new, smaller gap. But by the time he reaches the tortoise's new position, the tortoise has moved again, fractionally, almost imperceptibly, but genuinely, it is further ahead. And again Achilles runs to where it was, and again it has inched forward, and again, and again, and the gap shrinks and shrinks, but it never, in this telling, closes. Every time Achilles arrives at the place the tortoise was, the tortoise is somewhere else, not far, not by any meaningful distance, but somewhere else. And the logical conclusion, drawn with the cold precision that made Zeno the most hated dinner guest in Elea, is that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise. The fastest man alive, beaten by the slowest creature, not through strength or cunning, but through the simple and apparently irrefutable logic of infinite divisibility. The trick, if you can call it a trick, is the same one that powers the dichotomy, but here it wears a story's clothing, and stories are harder to dismiss than abstractions. We can feel the injustice of it. We want Achilles to win. We know Achilles would win. Every muscle in our body understands that a man running at full speed will overtake a plodding tortoise, and yet the argument, as stated, contains no obvious flaw. Each step in the reasoning is valid. Each premise is true, and the conclusion, absurd as it is, follows from those premises with the remorseless inevitability of gravity. What makes this paradox subtly different from the dichotomy is the introduction of a second moving body. The dichotomy concerns itself with a single traveler attempting to reach a single destination. Achilles and the tortoise introduces a pursuer and a pursued, and in doing so, it raises a question about the relationship between two infinite processes happening simultaneously. Achilles is generating his own infinite series of diminishing distances, and the tortoise is generating its own. And Zeno's argument depends on the claim that these two series can never fully resolve, that the gap between them can shrink without limit but never reach zero. The modern response, again, invokes convergent series. The total distance Achilles must cover to overtake the tortoise is finite, and he covers it in a finite time, and the paradox dissolves. But once more, the mathematical resolution, tidy as it is, does not address the deeper question Zeno was asking, which was not about arithmetic, but about the nature of space itself. Is space infinitely divisible? Can a line truly be carved into an infinite number of points? And if it can, what does that mean for the things that move through it? Aristotle, who was born a century after Zeno, and who took these paradoxes more seriously than most, distinguished between what he called a potential infinity and an actual infinity. Space, he argued, is potentially infinitely divisible, meaning you can always imagine cutting it further, but it is never actually divided into an infinite number of parts. You do not have to complete an infinite number of steps, because those steps do not all exist simultaneously. They are created by the act of division, and the act of division is something you choose to do or not do. It is a neat solution, and it held sway for nearly 2,000 years. But it did not satisfy everyone, and the debate continues to this day, because Zeno, even from 25 centuries away, has a way of refusing to be answered. And then comes the strangest of them all. Suppose you have made your peace with the dichotomy. Suppose you have accepted that Achilles catches the tortoise. Suppose you are willing to let motion exist, to let runners run and walkers walk, and the world go about its noisy, chaotic, endlessly moving business. Zeno has one more question for you, and it is the question that keeps physicists awake at night even now. He asks you to consider an arrow in flight. Not an arrow at the beginning of its journey, not an arrow at the end. An arrow at a single, frozen, instantaneous moment of time, a slice of reality so thin that it has no duration at all. At that instant, where is the arrow? It is in a particular place. It occupies a particular region of space. It is, at that exact moment, exactly where it is and nowhere else. It is not moving to the left. It is not moving to the right. It is not moving at all. Because movement requires time, and in an instant, a true mathematical instant with zero duration, there is no time in which movement can occur. The arrow at any given instant is at rest. But here is the paradox. If the arrow is at rest at every single instant of its flight, and if the flight is composed of nothing but instants, then when does it move? If every frame of the film shows a still image, how can the film show motion? You cannot assemble motion out of stillness, Zeno argues, any more than you can assemble a heap of sand out of individual grains that are not sand. Motion, if it is to be found at all, must exist within the instants themselves, but within a durationless instant, motion is a contradiction in terms. A thing cannot be in the process of changing its position if there is no process, no duration, no passage from one state to the next. The arrow paradox strikes at something different from its siblings. The dichotomy and Achilles and the tortoise concern the infinite divisibility of space. The arrow concerns the nature of time. It asks whether time is made up of instants the way a line is made up of points, and if so, how anything can happen within those instants, given that an instant, by definition, is too small to contain an event. It is a paradox about the relationship between the continuous and the discrete, between the flowing river and the individual droplets, and it anticipates, by more than 2 millennia, some of the deepest questions in modern physics. For what is quantum mechanics? At its heart, if not a reckoning with precisely this problem, the quantum world does not give us smooth, continuous motion. It gives us discrete jumps, particles that are here and then there, with no journey in between. Electrons that orbit an atom not by traveling in a circle, but by vanishing from one energy level and appearing at another. Like a traveler who leaves London and arrives in Paris without ever crossing the Channel, Zeno could not have known about quantum mechanics. He could not have known about Planck length or Planck time, the smallest meaningful units of space and time that modern physics allows. But the question he was asking, the question of whether motion is truly continuous or whether it is somehow stitched together from motionless pieces, is the same question that haunts the foundations of physics today. And there is something almost meditative about it, something that belongs to the late hours of the night when sleep is close but not yet arrived. The arrow hangs in the air, frozen, permanent, a thing caught between departure and arrival, between the bow and the target, suspended in a moment that has no thickness. It is not going anywhere. It is simply there, exactly where it is, and the paradox asks you to wonder whether there is a difference between an arrow at rest and an arrow in flight, if, at any given instant, you cannot tell them apart. But Zeno, who apparently felt that 3 paradoxes were insufficient to ruin a person's evening, devised a 4th, and it is the one that modern scholars find the most difficult to reconstruct and the most tantalizing to debate. It is called the stadium, and it is, in its setup, deceptively simple, and in its implications, profoundly unsettling. Picture 3 rows of objects, arranged in parallel, like soldiers standing in formation. The first row is stationary. The second row moves to the right. The third row moves to the left, at the same speed as the second. Each row contains the same number of equally spaced objects. Now, as the 2 moving rows pass the stationary row and each other simultaneously, Zeno asks you to compare how many positions each object passes relative to the stationary row versus how many positions it passes relative to the objects in the other moving row. Here is the trouble. Relative to the stationary row, an object in the second row passes, let us say, 1 position in 1 unit of time. But relative to the third row, which is moving in the opposite direction, the same object passes 2 positions in the same unit of time. If you believe that time can be broken down into the smallest possible indivisible units, which many of Zeno's opponents did, then you have a problem. In 1 indivisible unit of time, the moving object passes 1 stationary object, but 2 moving objects. This means that the moving object must have passed the first of those 2 moving objects in half an indivisible unit of time. But an indivisible unit, by definition, cannot be halved. It is the smallest possible slice. There is nothing smaller, and yet the relative motion of the rows demands that something smaller exist. The stadium paradox is an argument against the atomicity of time, against the idea that time comes in discrete, indivisible chunks. If time has a smallest unit, Zeno argues, then relative motion between objects moving in opposite directions creates situations that require subdivisions of that smallest unit, which is a contradiction. And if time does not have a smallest unit, if it is infinitely divisible, then the arrow paradox returns to haunt you, because infinitely divisible time is composed of durationless instants, and in durationless instants, nothing can move. Zeno has, with the patience of a man who has all the time in the world, which is ironic given the subject matter, constructed a trap with no exit. If time is discrete, the stadium paradox catches you. If time is continuous, the arrow catches you. If space is infinitely divisible, the dichotomy and Achilles catch you. Every escape route leads to another paradox. Every solution opens a new problem. And this, more than any individual argument, is Zeno's true achievement. He did not prove that motion is impossible. What he proved is that our understanding of motion, space, and time contains contradictions so deep that we cannot resolve them without fundamentally rethinking what we mean by those words. The ancient world responded to Zeno in various ways. Diogenes the Cynic, a man whose approach to philosophy was considerably more physical than most, is said to have responded to Zeno's paradoxes by simply standing up and walking across the room. The crowd cheered. The point was made. Motion exists. But Zeno, had he been present, might have smiled, because Diogenes had missed the point entirely. Zeno never said you could not walk across a room. He said you could not explain how you walk across a room. And the walk itself, however triumphant, was not an explanation. Aristotle attempted a more rigorous response, as we have discussed, distinguishing potential from actual infinities. The Stoics had their own answers. The Epicureans, who believed that the universe was composed of indivisible atoms moving through a void, thought they could dodge the paradoxes by denying infinite divisibility altogether, though this made them vulnerable to the stadium. And for centuries, Zeno's paradoxes occupied a peculiar position in intellectual history, universally acknowledged, widely discussed, and never fully resolved. It was not until the 19th century, when mathematicians like Augustin Louis Cauchy and Karl Weierstrass developed the rigorous theory of limits, that the mathematical side of the paradoxes was formally addressed. The convergent series that resolves the dichotomy in Achilles was placed on firm logical foundations. An infinite number of terms can sum to a finite value. An infinite number of diminishing time intervals can fit within a finite duration. The mathematics works. It is clean and elegant and unanswerable on its own terms. But Zeno's paradoxes are not merely mathematical. They are physical. They are metaphysical. They ask what space is, what time is, whether the continuum is real or merely a useful fiction, whether the universe at its most fundamental level is smooth or granular, whether motion is something that happens to objects or something that objects do, whether the present moment has any duration or is an infinitely thin boundary between a past that no longer exists and a future that does not yet exist. These are not questions that calculus can answer. These are questions that sit at the intersection of mathematics, physics, and philosophy, and they remain, after 2,500 years, genuinely open. Zeno himself did not live to see any of this. According to one ancient account, he died in a failed plot to overthrow a tyrant in Elea, a story that, if true, suggests he was a man who took action quite seriously for someone who denied its logical possibility. Another account has him biting off his own tongue and spitting it at his captor, which is the sort of detail that sounds invented but which you desperately want to be true, because it is exactly the kind of final gesture you would expect from a man who spent his life proving that gestures are impossible. He left behind a legacy that is almost unique in the history of ideas. Most ancient thinkers are studied for their answers. Zeno is studied for his questions. His paradoxes did not solve anything. They were never meant to. They were meant to unsettle, to disturb, to take the ground you thought was solid and show you the cracks running through it. And they succeeded. They succeeded so thoroughly that even now, in an age of quantum field theory and relativistic spacetime, in an age when we can calculate the trajectory of a spacecraft to within a fraction of a millimeter, Zeno's question, the oldest question, the question of how anything gets from here to there, still does not have an answer that satisfies everyone. And so you lie in the dark, and you think about the room, and the door, and the infinite halves between you and the place you want to reach. And maybe the question is not whether you can cross the room. Maybe the question is whether the room is what you think it is, whether the space between you and the door is a simple, smooth, continuous emptiness, or whether it is something stranger, something deeper, something that contains within it an infinity you can feel but never quite hold in your hands. The distances get smaller, the question gets larger, and somewhere in the space between the two, in the gap that never quite closes, sleep finds you at last, drifting off into a darkness that is, if Zeno was right, composed of an infinite number of moments in which you are neither awake nor asleep, but simply, perfectly, endlessly still. But stillness, as it turns out, is not the only thing that refuses to hold its shape under scrutiny. Because while you were lying there, thinking about distances that have and arrows that hover, something else was happening. Something so quiet and so gradual that you would never have noticed it unless someone forced you to look. You were changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the cells in your body were dying and being replaced. Your skin was shedding and regenerating. The molecules that made up your fingernails and your liver and the soft tissue of your brain were cycling through their slow and ceaseless rotation. Old matter out, new matter in, a process so constant and so thorough that the body you fall asleep in tonight is not, in any material sense, the same body you fell asleep in 7 years ago. Every atom has been swapped. Every cell has been traded. You are, at the level of physical substance, a completely different person than the one who first lay down on this pillow all those years ago. And yet you feel like you. You remember being you. You answer to the same name. You carry the same scars, the same habits, the same unreasonable fondness for cold coffee or the smell of rain on warm pavement. If someone showed you a photograph of yourself from a decade ago, you would say, without hesitation, "That is me." But is it? And what, exactly, do you mean by that? Because the ancient Greeks asked this question too, and the answer they arrived at has been troubling people for well over 2,000 years. The story, as it has come down to us through the writings of Plutarch, concerns the ship of the Athenian hero Theseus. After Theseus returned from his famous voyage, the Athenians preserved his ship in the harbor as a monument, a sacred relic of the man who had saved their city. But wood rots, salt water corrodes. The Mediterranean sun bakes and cracks and bleaches. And so, over time, as the planks of the ship began to decay, the Athenians replaced them. One plank at a time, carefully, reverently, each new piece of timber cut to the same dimensions and fitted into the same position as the one it replaced. The ship remained in the harbor. It still looked like the ship of Theseus. It still sat where the ship of Theseus had always sat. The people still called it the ship of Theseus. But after enough years had passed and enough planks had been replaced, a question began to form, a question that started as a murmur among the dockhands and the philosophers who frequented the harbor, and that grew, over the centuries, into one of the most enduring puzzles in the history of human thought. If every single plank of the original ship has been replaced, is it still the ship of Theseus? The question sounds almost too simple to be interesting, and yet the moment you begin to answer it, you find yourself sinking into a kind of philosophical quicksand from which there is no graceful exit. If you say yes, it is still the ship of Theseus, then you are saying that identity does not depend on material composition, that a thing can remain itself even after every physical part of it has been changed. But this raises an uncomfortable follow-up. If the ship's identity does not depend on its parts, then what does it depend on? Its shape, its function, its name, the collective agreement of the people who look at it? And if those things are enough to preserve identity, then could you build an entirely new ship from scratch, give it the same shape and the same name, and call it the ship of Theseus with equal justification? And if you say no, it is no longer the ship of Theseus, then you face a different problem, because you must identify the precise moment at which it stopped being the original ship. Was it the first plank? The 50th? The last? At what point did the ship of Theseus become a different ship? And what was it in the intervening period, when some planks were original and some were new? Was it partially the ship of Theseus? 70% the ship of Theseus? Is identity something that can leak out of an object the way water leaks out of a cracked hull, one drop at a time, until the vessel is empty? The philosopher Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, added a further twist that transformed the paradox from merely troubling to genuinely maddening. Suppose, Hobbes suggested, that as each old plank was removed from the ship, someone collected it and stored it in a warehouse. And suppose that when all the planks had been replaced and the refurbished ship sat gleaming in the harbor, this collector took all the original planks and reassembled them into a ship using exactly the same arrangement, the same joints, the same structure. Now you have two ships, one in the harbor, built entirely of new wood but maintaining an unbroken continuity of form and function and public recognition, and one in the warehouse, built entirely of the original wood, but having been disassembled and stored in pieces for years before being put back together. Which one is the ship of Theseus? The harbor ship has the history. It has the continuity. It has been sitting in the same spot, serving the same symbolic function, recognized by the same people for the entire duration of the replacement process. It was never not the ship of Theseus, at least not in the eyes of anyone who was watching. But the warehouse ship has the material, every single atom of the original vessel is in that hull. If identity is about physical substance, about the actual stuff a thing is made of, then the warehouse ship has a stronger claim. It is, in the most literal sense, the ship that Theseus sailed. And so you are stuck. Both ships have a legitimate claim. Neither claim is clearly stronger than the other. And the reason neither claim is clearly stronger is that we do not, it turns out, have a coherent theory of what makes a thing the same thing over time. We think we do. We navigate the world as though identity is obvious, as though the coffee mug you used this morning is straightforwardly the same mug you will use tomorrow, as though your childhood home is still your childhood home, even after the roof has been redone and the carpets torn up and the wallpaper stripped away. But the moment you press on these intuitions, the moment you ask what exactly you mean when you say something is the same thing, the whole structure starts to creak, and you find yourself standing in a harbor, looking at two ships, and knowing, with a quiet certainty that borders on vertigo, that you cannot choose between them. But ships are things. They are objects, possessions, collections of timber and rope and pitch. We can afford to be puzzled about ships. The question becomes considerably more personal, considerably more urgent, when you realize that the paradox does not stop at the waterline, because you, lying here in the dark, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of the blankets on your chest, are a ship of Theseus too. The human body replaces its cells at different rates. The cells lining your stomach are replaced every few days. Your skin cells cycle out every 2 to 3 weeks. Red blood cells last about 4 months. The cells in your liver take roughly a year. Even the skeleton, which feels so solid, so permanent, so foundationally you, is completely replaced over the course of a decade. The brain is more complicated, with some neurons lasting a lifetime and others being replaced, and the precise nature of neural turnover is still a matter of active scientific debate. But the point stands. The body you are lying in right now is not the body you were born in. It is not even the body you had last year. You have been rebuilt piece by piece, without ever being taken out of service, without ever ceasing to function, without ever, at any point, stopping and restarting. You are the harbor ship. You have been continuously present the whole time, but your planks are all new. And this, of course, is where the paradox stops being an amusing thought experiment and starts being something you can feel in your chest. Because if your identity is not your body, not the specific collection of atoms currently arranged in the shape of you, then what is it? Is it your memories? But memories are encoded in physical structures, in synaptic connections and protein configurations, and those structures are themselves subject to replacement and degradation. Memories also change every time you recall them. The act of remembering is an act of reconstruction, not retrieval, and each reconstruction introduces subtle distortions, like a photocopy of a photocopy, growing fainter and less faithful with each iteration. The memory you have of your 10th birthday is not the same memory you had at 11. It has been rebuilt, revised, edited by everything you have experienced since. It is a ship of Theseus, too. Is your identity your personality, then? Your habits, your preferences, your characteristic way of laughing or losing your temper or holding a fork? But these change over the course of a lifetime, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly. The person you were at 15, with all their passions and terrors and certainties, is in many ways a stranger to the person you are now. You might not even like that person if you met them. You might find them exhausting, or naive, or embarrassingly intense about things that no longer matter to you, and yet you say that person was you. You say it with conviction. You say it without thinking, because thinking about it too carefully leads to a place where the floor drops away and you find yourself hovering above a question you cannot answer. The ancient Greeks were not the only ones to worry about this. But it took a British sitcom to give the paradox its most memorable modern restatement, and in doing so, to strip away the grandeur and the philosophy and reveal the comic absurdity at its core. In the television program Only Fools and Horses, a long-running BBC comedy about two brothers scraping a living in South London, there is a character named Trigger, a road sweeper of limited intellect and unlimited sincerity, who proudly declares that he has had the same broom for 20 years. When his companions express admiration at the broom's longevity, Trigger clarifies, "The broom has had 17 new heads and 14 new handles, but it is, he insists, the same broom." He even has a photograph of himself holding it to prove it. The joke works because it is absurd. Of course, it is not the same broom. A broom is its head and its handle. Replace both and you have a new broom that merely occupies the same role. The audience laughs because Trigger is confused, because he has mistaken continuity of function for continuity of identity, and because he does not understand that a thing is its parts, not its job. But the laughter has a nervous edge, or it should, because Trigger's logic is not actually different from the logic we use when we say that a nation is the same nation after every citizen has been replaced by the next generation, or that a football club is the same club after every player has been transferred, and every manager sacked, and the stadium itself has been torn down and rebuilt on a different site. We laugh at Trigger because his example is small and silly, a broom. We do not laugh when the same logic is applied to things we care about, to institutions and countries and human beings, because in those cases, we need the logic to work. We need continuity to be real. We need to be able to say that the person waking up tomorrow is the same person who fell asleep tonight, even though, at the level of atoms, even though, at the level of memories and moods and the ceaseless flux of consciousness, the evidence for that claim is considerably weaker than we would like it to be. Trigger's broom, as the thought experiment has come to be known, is the ship of Theseus in working clothes, and its genius is that it makes the paradox accessible to anyone who has ever replaced a part and wondered whether the whole survived the surgery. A car with a new engine, a house with a new roof, a band with no original members. At what point does the thing stop being the thing? And who gets to decide? But suppose we skip the slow plank-by-plank approach altogether. Suppose the replacement happens not gradually, over years of careful maintenance, but instantaneously, all at once, in a single blinding moment. This is the scenario imagined by the philosopher Derek Parfit, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most disturbing thought experiments in the history of philosophy. Parfit asks you to imagine a teleportation device. You step into a machine in London. The machine scans every single atom in your body, recording its exact type, position, and state with perfect accuracy. It then destroys your body, reducing it to its constituent elements, and transmits the information to a second machine in New York, which uses a fresh supply of atoms to construct an exact replica. Atom for atom, molecule for molecule, synapse for synapse, the replica is identical to you in every measurable way. It has your memories, it has your personality. It has the small scar on your left knee from when you fell off a bicycle at age 9. It wakes up in New York, stretches, and goes about your day, picking up exactly where you left off. Is the person who walks out of the machine in New York you? Most people, upon first considering this, say yes. The replica has everything that matters. It thinks it is you. It remembers being you. It will live your life and love your family and finish reading the book you left on the nightstand. For all practical purposes, it is you. The fact that the atoms are different is irrelevant, because your atoms are being replaced all the time anyway, and nobody considers that a problem. But Parfit then introduces a variation that changes everything. Suppose the machine in London malfunctions. It scans you and transmits the information, and the replica is successfully constructed in New York, but the original body in London is not destroyed. It is damaged, perhaps fatally, but for a few minutes you are still conscious, still alive, still standing in the machine, and you know that your replica is now walking around New York, living your life, calling your mother, sleeping in your bed. Are you comforted by this? Does the knowledge that a perfect copy of you exists make you feel as though you are not really dying? Or does it feel, in those final minutes, exactly like dying, complete and total and unredeemable, regardless of what is happening 3,000 miles away? For most people, the answer is immediate and visceral. The copy is not you. It is someone else. Someone who happens to share your memories and your face and your fondness for cold coffee. But it is not you, because you are here, in London, dying, and no amount of duplication can change that. And if the copy is not you when the original survives, then why should it be you when the original is destroyed? The only difference between the two scenarios is timing. In the first, the original is destroyed before the copy is activated. In the second, there is a brief overlap, but the process is the same. The machine always destroys and rebuilds. The question is whether destruction followed by perfect reconstruction is the same thing as survival, or whether it is simply death with a very efficient understudy. Parfit himself arrived at a conclusion that most people find either liberating or terrifying, depending on their temperament. He argued that personal identity, in the deep metaphysical sense that most of us take for granted, does not exist. What we call identity is really just a bundle of psychological connections, memories linked to memories, intentions linked to actions, personality traits persisting over time. And these connections can be stronger or weaker, can fade or strengthen, can be duplicated or disrupted. But there is no further fact, no soul, no essential self, no metaphysical thread running through time that makes you you. You are not a ship. You are a pattern, and patterns can be copied. And when a pattern is copied perfectly, the copy is not an imitation. It is another instance of the same thing. Neither is the original. Neither is the copy. The distinction itself is meaningless. This is, to put it mildly, not a conclusion that most people find easy to accept at 3 a.m. And yet the question of what makes you you is not merely a philosophical indulgence. It has consequences that press against the walls of law, of medicine, of ethics, of the way you treat the person in the mirror, and the way you think about the person you will become. If you are not the same person you were 10 years ago, in what sense are you responsible for the things that person did? If a man commits a crime at 20 and is caught at 60, having lived a blameless life in the interim, having been rebuilt cell by cell and thought by thought into someone who bears almost no resemblance to the young man who broke the law, is it just to punish him? We say yes, reflexively, because our legal systems depend on the continuity of personal identity, on the assumption that the person standing in the courtroom is the same person who pulled the trigger or signed the fraudulent contract. But the assumption is exactly that, an assumption, a useful fiction, a plank we have nailed into the hull of civilization, because without it, the whole vessel falls apart. The 17th century philosopher John Locke tried to anchor personal identity in memory, arguing that you are the same person as a past version of yourself if, and only if, you remember being that person. This has a certain intuitive appeal. You feel like you because you remember being you. The thread that connects the child to the adult, to the elderly person lying in bed, is the thread of memory, each moment linked to the last by the continuity of conscious experience. But Locke's account has problems, as the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid was quick to point out. An old general, Reid imagined, might remember being a young officer, and the young officer might remember being a schoolboy who was once flogged for stealing apples. But the old general might have no memory whatsoever of the flogging. If identity depends on memory, then the young officer is the same person as the schoolboy, and the general is the same person as the officer, but the general is not the same person as the schoolboy. Identity, under Locke's account, is not transitive, which is a polite way of saying it does not work. David Hume, the great Scottish skeptic, took a different and altogether more radical approach. He looked inward, searched for the self, and reported with the cheerful honesty of a man delivering bad news over a good meal that he could not find it. "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself," he wrote, "I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. The self," Hume concluded, "is not a thing. It is a bundle, a loose confederation of perceptions and experiences that we tie together with the ribbon of habit and call a person. Cut the ribbon, and the bundle falls apart, and what is left is not a self, but a collection of impressions with no owner. This is the problem of personal identity in its purest form, and it has no solution, not because philosophers have been insufficiently clever, but because the problem may not be the kind of thing that admits a solution. It may be that identity is not a fact about the world, but a story we tell, a narrative we construct to make sense of the otherwise bewildering continuity of consciousness, and that the story, like all stories, is a simplification, a useful lie, a way of turning the roaring chaos of experience into something with a beginning and a middle and a character you can root for. And perhaps that is what makes these paradoxes so well suited to the hours before sleep, to the dimming of the lights and the quieting of the mind, and the slow dissolution of the boundary between waking and dreaming. Because sleep itself is a kind of ship of Theseus problem. The person who falls asleep is not quite the person who wakes up. The memories have been reorganized and filed, some strengthened and some allowed to fade. The brain has been busy all night, pruning and rewiring, running its own quiet maintenance program. And the consciousness that returns in the morning, the voice inside your head that says, "I am awake, I am here, I am still me," is making a claim that cannot be verified from the inside, because the only tool you have for checking your identity is the very identity you are trying to check. You are the ship in the harbor. You have always been the ship in the harbor. But every plank has been replaced, and in a warehouse somewhere, in the recesses of memory and the shedding of cells and the slow erosion of everything you used to be, there is another version of you, assembled from all the original pieces, a stranger who shares your name and your scars, but who has not been present for any of the things that happened to you since the replacement began. And the question of which one of you is real is not a question that has an answer. It is a question that has a feeling, a particular kind of vertigo, like looking down from a great height into water that is dark and clear and impossibly deep. The planks creak, the harbor is quiet, and somewhere in the space between the ship you were and the ship you are, the question dissolves. Not because it has been answered, but because you have drifted too far from shore to hear it anymore. But the harbor is not the only thing that can fall silent when you press too hard against its edges. Language can do it too. Words, those dependable little vessels we use to carry meaning from one mind to another, can be made to buckle and crack and fold in on themselves until they mean nothing at all, or worse, until they mean two things at once, things that cannot both be true, and yet somehow, infuriatingly, undeniably, are. It begins with a single sentence. You have almost certainly heard it before, perhaps in a classroom, perhaps in a conversation that got out of hand, Perhaps in one of those idle moments when the mind, left to its own devices, begins to chew on itself the way a dog chews a bone it has already stripped clean. The sentence is this. This sentence is false. This sentence is false. Is it true? If it is true, then what it says must be the case, and what it says is that it is false. So, if it is true, it is false. Very well then, suppose it is false. If it is false, then what it says is not the case, and what it says is that it is false. So if that claim is not the case, then the sentence is not false, which means it is true. So if it is false, it is true. Round and round it goes, like a cat chasing its own tail in a room with no corners, each answer collapsing into its opposite the moment you try to set it down. True becomes false, becomes true, becomes false, and the sentence sits there, patient and small and perfectly constructed, refusing to be either one. It is not ambiguous. It is not vague. It is not poorly worded. It says exactly what it means, with a precision that would satisfy the most demanding grammarian, and what it means is impossible. The liar's paradox is old. It is so old that it makes the questions about motion and identity that occupied the earlier hours of this night look like recent arrivals. Its earliest known formulation comes from Epimenides, a Cretan philosopher and poet who lived in the 6th century BC, a man about whom almost nothing is known with certainty, except that he said something that has refused to be forgotten. Epimenides declared, "All Cretans are liars." And because Epimenides was himself a Cretan, the statement, if true, would mean that he, as a Cretan, was a liar, which would mean the statement was false. And if the statement was false, then not all Cretans are liars, which would mean Epimenides might be telling the truth, which would make the statement true again. Now, to be precise, Epimenides' version is not quite a perfect paradox. It has escape routes. Perhaps Epimenides is the one honest Cretan. Perhaps he is lying about everything except this particular claim. The logic wobbles but does not completely collapse. It took later thinkers to strip the paradox down to its bare, inescapable form. The Megarian philosopher Eubulides, who lived in the 4th century BC, and who had a gift for making simple things impossible, is generally credited with the purest ancient formulation. A man says, "I am lying." If he is lying, he is telling the truth. If he is telling the truth, he is lying. No escape routes, no wiggle room, just the clean, closed loop of a statement that devours itself. The ancient world found this troubling but manageable. It was a curiosity, a trick of language, something to discuss over wine, and then set aside when more pressing matters demanded attention. The Stoic philosopher Chrysippus is said to have written 6 treatises on the liar's paradox, none of which survive, which is either a terrible loss for intellectual history or a mercy, depending on how you feel about reading 6 books on a single sentence. The paradox was noted, catalogued, and largely left alone for 2,000 years, treated as a clever but ultimately harmless peculiarity of self-referential language, the philosophical equivalent of a parlor trick. It was not harmless. It was a crack in the foundation, and the building just had not fallen yet. The building began to fall at the turn of the 20th century, in the quiet, lamp-lit studies of men who were trying to do something that sounds, on its face, entirely reasonable. They were trying to put mathematics on a solid foundation. They wanted to prove that mathematics was consistent, that it contained no contradictions, that every statement that could be formulated within a mathematical system could, in principle, be determined to be either true or false, and that the system would never, under any circumstances, tell you that something was both. This was not an idle ambition. It was, for the mathematicians of the late 19th century, a matter of urgent necessity. Strange things had been happening at the edges of mathematics. Georg Cantor had been exploring the infinite and had discovered that some infinities were larger than others, a finding that was both demonstrably correct and deeply offensive to the intuitions of nearly everyone who heard it. The foundations of calculus, which had been in use for 2 centuries, turned out to rest on concepts that had never been properly defined, and set theory, the branch of mathematics that was supposed to provide the bedrock for everything else, was developing cracks of its own. It was into this anxious, ambitious, slightly desperate atmosphere that Bertrand Russell, a young British philosopher with a patrician manner and an intellect that could cut glass, delivered a discovery that would shake mathematics to its core. Russell was not trying to cause trouble. He was trying to solve it. He was working through the foundations of set theory as laid out by the German logician Gottlob Frege, a man who had spent decades constructing what he believed to be a complete and consistent logical framework for all of arithmetic. Frege's system was elegant, rigorous, and nearly finished. Russell admired it enormously. And then, in 1901, Russell found the crack. The crack was this. In Frege's system, and in naive set theory more generally, a set could be defined by any property: the set of all red things, the set of all even numbers, the set of all sets that contain exactly 3 elements. Any well-defined property could generate a set, and any set was a legitimate mathematical object. This seemed perfectly reasonable. But Russell asked a question that had the same quiet, devastating simplicity as the liar's sentence. "Consider," Russell said, "the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Call it R. Most sets do not contain themselves. The set of all cats is not itself a cat, so it does not contain itself. The set of all even numbers is not itself an even number, so it does not contain itself. These ordinary, well-behaved sets are members of R. But now ask, does R contain itself? If R does contain itself, then by definition, R is a set that contains itself, which means it does not satisfy the membership criterion for R, which requires its members to be sets that do not contain themselves. So, if R contains itself, it does not contain itself. If R does not contain itself, then R is a set that does not contain itself, which means it does satisfy the membership criterion, which means it should be a member of R, which means R does contain itself. So, if R does not contain itself, it does contain itself. The structure is identical to the liar. Containment replaces truth. Membership replaces assertion. But the result is the same: a perfectly well-formed question that cannot be answered without contradiction. And this time, the question was not about a sentence. It was about mathematics. It was about the system that was supposed to be the most reliable, most consistent, most trustworthy form of human reasoning ever devised, and it was broken. Russell wrote to Frege in June 1902, politely informing him of the paradox. Frege, to his eternal credit, recognized immediately what had happened. He appended a note to the 2nd volume of his life's work, his Grundgesetze der Arithmetik, which was at that very moment going to press. The note is one of the most poignant sentences in the history of intellectual endeavor. "A scientist," Frege wrote, "can hardly meet with anything more undesirable than to have the foundation give way just as the work is finished." He published the volume anyway, with the crack plainly visible, because he was an honest man, and honest men do not plaster over faults they know are structural. Russell himself attempted to explain the paradox to a broader audience through an analogy that has become nearly as famous as the paradox itself. It is called the barber paradox, and it goes like this. In a certain village, There is a barber who shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. The rule is clear. The rule is absolute. If a man shaves himself, the barber does not shave him. If a man does not shave himself, the barber does. Every man in the village is either shaved by the barber or shaves himself, with no overlap and no exceptions. Now, who shaves the barber? If the barber shaves himself, then he is a man who shaves himself, and by the rule, the barber does not shave men who shave themselves. So the barber cannot shave himself. But if the barber does not shave himself, then he is a man who does not shave himself, and by the rule, the barber shaves all such men. So the barber must shave himself. The barber cannot shave himself, and cannot not shave himself. He is trapped in the same loop as the lyre and as Russell's set, a loop created not by the complexity of the rules, but by their simplicity, by the clean, unforgiving logic of a system that refers to itself and, in doing so, ties itself into a knot that cannot be untied. The barber paradox is sometimes dismissed as a mere curiosity, a puzzle with a trivial solution. Such a barber simply cannot exist. The rules describe an impossible person, and we should no more be troubled by his non-existence than we should be troubled by the non-existence of a married bachelor or a square circle. And this is true, as far as it goes. But the point of the barber is not the barber. The point is what the barber tells us about the rules. If a simple, clearly stated rule can generate a contradiction, then the rules themselves are suspect. And if the rules of set theory, the rules that underpin all of mathematics, can generate contradictions, then mathematics itself is suspect, and the project of building a consistent, complete foundation for human reasoning is in very serious trouble. The trouble would only get worse. In the wake of Russell's paradox, mathematicians scrambled to repair the foundations. Russell himself, together with Alfred North Whitehead, spent a decade producing the Principia Mathematica, a monumental work that attempted to rebuild the logical foundations of mathematics from scratch, using a system of types designed to prevent self-referential paradoxes from ever arising. The idea was elegant. Arrange mathematical objects into a hierarchy so that a set could only contain objects of a lower type than itself, which would make it impossible for a set to contain itself, which would make Russell's paradox impossible to formulate. It was a patch, but it was a patch that worked, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the crisis had been averted. Meanwhile, in Germany, the great mathematician David Hilbert was pursuing an even grander ambition. Hilbert wanted to prove, once and for all, that mathematics was both consistent, meaning it could never produce a contradiction, and complete, meaning that every true mathematical statement could, in principle, be proved within the system. This was Hilbert's program, and it was the mathematical equivalent of trying to build a building so solid that it could withstand any earthquake, any flood, any force that the universe could throw at it. It was noble, it was inspiring, and it was, as a quiet young Austrian was about to demonstrate, impossible. Kurt Gödel was 25 years old in 1931 when he published a paper that is widely regarded as the most important result in the history of mathematical logic. He was slight, meticulous, prone to anxiety, and possessed of a mind so precise that even his colleagues, men accustomed to extraordinary feats of abstraction, found his thinking uncanny. He had grown up in Brno, in what is now the Czech Republic, had studied in Vienna, and had, by his mid-20s, become quietly obsessed with the question that Hilbert had posed. Can mathematics prove its own consistency? Gödel's answer was no, and the way he arrived at that answer was, in its own way, a paradox worthy of the ancients. What Gödel did was this. He took a formal mathematical system, a system powerful enough to express basic arithmetic, and he constructed within that system a mathematical statement that said in effect, "This statement cannot be proved within this system." Not in those words, of course. Gödel's actual construction was a feat of technical virtuosity that involved assigning numbers to every symbol, every formula, and every proof in the system, a technique now known as Gödel numbering, which allowed him to translate statements about the system into statements within the system, turning the language of mathematics in on itself like a snake swallowing its own tail. And the result was devastating. If the statement, "This statement cannot be proved," is true, then it cannot be proved, which means the system is incomplete. There exists a true statement that the system cannot demonstrate. And if the statement is false, then it can be proved, which means the system has proved something false, which means the system is inconsistent. Either way, you lose. Either mathematics is incomplete, containing truths it cannot reach, or it is inconsistent, containing falsehoods it cannot detect. You cannot have both consistency and completeness. You must choose, and neither choice is painless. Gödel's first incompleteness theorem, as it came to be known, did not destroy mathematics. Mathematics continued to function, as it always had, as the most powerful and reliable tool humanity had ever developed for understanding the world. But the theorem did destroy the dream of a perfect foundation. It proved that no system of sufficient power can ever be both complete and consistent, that there will always be truths that lie beyond the reach of proof, that the ambition to contain all of mathematics within a single, contradiction-free framework was not merely difficult, but logically impossible. The building that Hilbert had dreamed of could not be built, not because the architects lacked skill, but because the laws of logic themselves forbade it. And Gödel's second incompleteness theorem twisted the knife. It showed that a consistent mathematical system cannot prove its own consistency. If you want to know whether your system is free of contradictions, you must step outside it and use a more powerful system to check. But that more powerful system is itself subject to the same limitation. It cannot prove its own consistency without an even more powerful system, and so on forever, an infinite tower of systems, each one unable to vouch for itself, each one requiring the testimony of a higher authority that is equally unable to vouch for itself. The echo of the liar is everywhere. A statement that refers to itself, a system that tries to evaluate itself, a language that turns its gaze inward and discovers at its own center a knot it cannot untie. Gödel's genius was to show that this is not a quirk of language or a flaw in a particular system. It is a fundamental feature of any system powerful enough to talk about itself. Self-reference breeds paradox the way still water breeds mosquitoes, inevitably, persistently, and despite all efforts to drain the swamp. Gödel himself would spend his later years at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he became close friends with Albert Einstein. The two men, both refugees from the European catastrophe, would take long walks together through the leafy New Jersey campus, talking about time and logic and the nature of the universe. Gödel grew increasingly reclusive, increasingly paranoid, increasingly convinced that people were trying to poison his food. He would eat only what his wife Adele prepared for him, and when Adele was hospitalized in 1977, Gödel, unable to trust anyone else, simply stopped eating. He died on the 14th of January 1978, weighing less than 30 kilograms, starved to death by a fear that his own brilliant, broken mind could not reason its way out of. The man who had proved that systems cannot fully understand themselves was, in the end, a system that could not fully understand itself. But the paradoxes of self-reference are not always dressed in the formal clothing of mathematics and logic. Sometimes they wear the simpler garments of a story. And sometimes the story is so strange, so perfectly balanced between sense and nonsense, that you can turn it over in your mind for hours without ever finding the flaw, if a flaw is what it is. A judge sentences a prisoner on a Saturday. The sentence is unusual. The prisoner is to be hanged on one day of the following week, sometime between Monday and Friday. But there is a condition. The hanging will come as a surprise. The prisoner will not know the day of his execution until the executioner knocks on his cell door that morning. The prisoner cannot, at any point, logically deduce which day he will hang. The prisoner returns to his cell and begins to think. He thinks very carefully, the way a man thinks when the stakes could not possibly be higher, and he arrives at a remarkable conclusion. He begins with Friday. Can the hanging take place on Friday? If he is still alive on Thursday night, then he will know that Friday is the only remaining day, and the hanging will not be a surprise. So the judge's conditions rule out Friday. With Friday eliminated, he considers Thursday. If he is still alive on Wednesday night, and he has already ruled out Friday, then Thursday is the last possible day, and he will know it. Thursday will not be a surprise either, so Thursday is eliminated. The same reasoning eliminates Wednesday, then Tuesday, then Monday. By the time the prisoner has worked through every day of the week, he has logically proved that the hanging cannot take place on any day without violating the surprise condition. He goes to bed on Sunday night relieved, even cheerful. The hanging is impossible. Logic has saved him. On Wednesday morning, the executioner knocks on his door. The prisoner is, needless to say, very surprised. The unexpected hanging paradox, which has also been called the surprise examination paradox when recast in a less lethal academic setting, is one of those rare puzzles that seems to resist every attempt at resolution. The prisoner's reasoning appears sound at every step. Each day is eliminated by the same logic, and the logic, taken in isolation, is impeccable. And yet the conclusion is obviously wrong, because the judge's sentence can clearly be carried out. The hanging does happen. The surprise is genuine. The logic that seemed so airtight was, in some way that is fiendishly difficult to pin down, leaking. Where is the leak? Philosophers have been arguing about this since the paradox first appeared in the 1940s, and there is no consensus. Some argue that the prisoner's error lies in his assumption that the judge's statement can be treated as a logical axiom, a premise from which valid deductions can be drawn. Perhaps the judge's promise is self-undermining. The very act of announcing that the hanging will be a surprise is what makes it possible for the prisoner to reason about it. And the prisoner's reasoning is what makes the surprise possible. And the circularity is the crack through which the paradox enters. Others argue that the prisoner's backward reasoning is valid only if he can genuinely rule out Friday, and that his ability to rule out Friday depends on his being alive on Thursday night, which depends on assumptions about whether earlier days have also been ruled out, creating a chain of conditionals that does not support the weight placed upon it. Still others have pointed out that the paradox involves a subtle confusion between different kinds of knowledge. The prisoner knows the judge's conditions, but does the prisoner know that he knows? And does the judge know that the prisoner knows? The hanging is a surprise relative to the prisoner's knowledge, but the prisoner is using his knowledge to eliminate possibilities, and the elimination of possibilities changes what counts as a surprise, which changes what can be eliminated, which changes what counts as a surprise again. The paradox is a hall of mirrors in which knowledge reflects off itself and produces an image that is both sharp and impossible. What makes the unexpected hanging so delicious, so perfectly suited to the borderland between waking and sleep, is that it is not a paradox about mathematics or physics or the nature of reality. It is a paradox about expectation, about the strange loop that forms when you try to predict something that is defined, in part, by your inability to predict it. It is about the gap between what you can reason and what you can know, between the world as logic describes it and the world as it actually behaves. The prisoner's logic was perfect. The world did not care. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the liar and all its descendants, from Epimenides' Cretans to Russell's sets to Gödel's theorems to the poor prisoner in his cell on Wednesday morning, blinking in the unexpected light. The lesson is not that logic is useless. Logic is the most powerful tool the human mind has ever sharpened. The lesson is that logic, like every powerful tool, has limits. And those limits are not found at the edges of the system, but at its center, in the very feature that makes it powerful in the first place. Its ability to refer to itself, to turn inward, to take its own operations as objects of inquiry. A sentence that talks about itself. A set that asks whether it contains itself. A mathematical system that tries to prove its own consistency. A prisoner who uses the terms of his sentence to reason about the sentence. In every case, the trouble comes not from complexity, but from reflexivity, from the moment when the eye tries to see itself, when the hand tries to grasp itself, when the mind, restless and precise and utterly relentless, tries to think about thinking and discovers, in the act, a darkness at the center of its own light. The liar sits at the bottom of all of this, as small and as ancient as a seed, a single sentence that contains within it the germ of everything that would follow, from the crisis of foundations in mathematics, to the limits of computation, to the strange, vertiginous feeling you get late at night when you wonder whether the thoughts you are thinking are the kind of thoughts that can be trusted, or whether the mind that is doing the wondering is the right mind to ask. This sentence is false. This thought is uncertain. This wakefulness is fading. And somewhere in the loop, between true and false, between provable and unprovable, between the prisoner's iron logic and the executioner's Wednesday morning knock, the questions stop chasing their tails and begin at last to slow, to circle, to settle into the quiet rhythm of a mind that has reached the point where it is too tired to reason, but not yet ready to let go of the thing it was reasoning about. The thing about being too tired to reason is that the mind does not stop. It shifts. It loosens. It begins to drift into that territory where ideas stop obeying the rules of the daytime, where the rigid boundaries between the possible and the impossible become soft and porous, and where the strangest thoughts feel, for a few drowsy moments, entirely natural. And it is in this territory, in this borderland between sense and nonsense, between the discipline of waking logic and the wild architecture of dreams, that infinity lives. Not the casual hand-waving infinity of everyday language, the kind people invoke when they say the queue was infinitely long or that the meeting went on forever. The real thing, the actual mathematical object, the infinity that mathematicians have spent centuries trying to tame, and that has repaid their efforts by behaving in ways so profoundly counterintuitive that even the people who understand it best will admit, in candid moments, that it makes their heads hurt. Infinity is not a number. It is a concept, and it is a concept that refuses to behave the way numbers behave. You cannot add to it and get something bigger. You cannot subtract from it and get something smaller. It breaks the rules of arithmetic, the rules of geometry, the rules of common sense, and it does so not because it is vague or poorly defined, but because it is perfectly well defined, and the things it does are genuinely, demonstrably, provably true. The paradoxes of infinity are not paradoxes in the sense that they contain contradictions. They are paradoxes in the older, deeper sense of the word. They are things that are true and yet seem impossible. Truths that the mind can verify but cannot quite believe. And the best place to begin is with a hotel. The hotel was imagined by David Hilbert, the same German mathematician whose grand ambition to secure the foundations of mathematics would be undone by an Austrian logician's devastating theorem. But before that unraveling, Hilbert was the most influential mathematician in the world, a man of enormous vision and equally enormous confidence, who stood before the International Congress of Mathematicians in 1900 and presented a list of 23 unsolved problems that he believed would shape the future of the discipline. Several of those problems remain unsolved to this day. But it was not one of his great unsolved problems that would capture the public imagination. It was a story about a hotel. Hilbert's Grand Hotel has infinitely many rooms. Not a lot of rooms. Not a very large number of rooms. Infinitely many. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, and so on, with no final room, no last door at the end of the corridor, no point at which the hallway terminates and the numbering stops. The rooms stretch on without end, each one numbered with a natural number, and every single one of them is occupied. The hotel is full. Every bed is taken. Every key is in the possession of a guest. The no vacancy sign, if such a thing could be said to apply to an infinite hotel, is illuminated. And then a new guest arrives. In a finite hotel, this would be the end of the story. The hotel is full. There is no room. The guest must be turned away. But Hilbert's hotel is not finite, and its manager, a figure of supernatural patience and logistical brilliance, has a solution. He simply asks every current guest to move to the next room. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2. The guest in room 2 moves to room 3. The guest in room 3 moves to room 4. Every guest, no matter how far down the corridor they reside, packs their bags and shuffles one door to the right. Because the hotel has no last room, every guest has a next room to move to. No one is displaced. No one is left without a bed. And room 1, the room at the beginning of the infinite hallway, is now empty. The new guest checks in. The hotel that was full is still full, but it now has one more guest than it had before. This is not a trick. It is not a sleight of hand. It is a straightforward consequence of what it means for a set to be infinite. An infinite set can be placed in a one-to-one correspondence with a proper subset of itself, which is a formal way of saying that you can remove pieces from it or add pieces to it without changing its size. The set of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, has exactly as many elements as the set of natural numbers starting from 2, which is 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. They are the same size. You can pair them up 1 to 1, 1 with 2, 2 with 3, 3 with 4, with nothing left over on either side. The set that is missing a member is the same size as the set that is not. Infinity minus 1 is still infinity. But Hilbert was not done. Suppose not one, but infinitely many new guests arrive. An infinite bus pulls up to the hotel, carrying a passenger for every natural number. Guest 1, guest 2, guest 3, and on without end. The hotel is already full. How do you accommodate an infinite number of new arrivals? The manager, unfazed, asks every current guest to move to the room with double their current room number. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2. The guest in room 2 moves to room 4. The guest in room 3 moves to room 6. Every current guest is now in an even-numbered room, and every odd-numbered room, room 1, room 3, room 5, room 7, and so on forever, is empty. Since there are infinitely many odd numbers, there are infinitely many empty rooms, and the infinite busload of new guests can be accommodated with ease, one guest per odd room, filling the gaps left behind. The hotel was full. An infinite number of new guests arrived. The hotel is still full. Everyone has a room. And the manager has not built a single new room, has not expanded the hotel by a single square meter. He has simply rearranged. He has used the inexhaustible elasticity of infinity to make room where, by any finite standard, no room existed. And then, because infinity is nothing if not generous with its absurdities, suppose infinitely many infinite buses arrive. Bus after bus after bus. An endless convoy of vehicles, each carrying an infinite number of passengers, pulling into the hotel's infinitely long driveway. Can the manager accommodate them all? He can. The method is more intricate, involving prime numbers and their powers, each bus assigned a different prime, each passenger on each bus assigned a room based on that prime raised to the power of their seat number. But the result is the same. Everyone gets a room. The hotel is full. The hotel was always full. Fullness in the realm of the infinite is not the barrier it is in the realm of the finite. It is merely a starting condition, a point of departure, a thing to be rearranged rather than a limit to be respected. Hilbert used the hotel not as a formal theorem, but as a teaching tool, a way to make the bizarre properties of infinite sets vivid and concrete, to bring them down from the austere heights of set theory and into a world of bellhops and suitcases and tired travelers looking for a bed. And it works. Not because the hotel is realistic, but because its unreality is precisely the point. The hotel feels wrong. It feels like cheating. It feels as though the manager is pulling a fast one, as though somewhere in the infinite corridor there must be a guest who has been forgotten, a room that has been double booked, a crack in the logic that a sufficiently determined auditor could find. But there is no crack. The logic is sound. The mathematics is clean. And the feeling of wrongness, that persistent sense that something cannot be right, is not a sign that the argument has a flaw. It is a sign that your intuitions were built for a finite world and are encountering, for perhaps the first time, a world in which the rules are fundamentally different. But the strangeness of the infinite is not confined to the arithmetic of hotel rooms. It extends into geometry, into the very fabric of space, and there it produces results that are, if anything, even more disturbing than Hilbert's infinite accommodations. Because the arithmetic of the hotel, strange as it is, at least deals with abstract objects, with numbers and sets and correspondences that exist in the clean, intangible realm of pure mathematics. The next paradox deals with something you can hold in your hand. It deals with a sphere, a solid ball of matter, something as ordinary and familiar as an orange or a tennis ball. And what it does with that sphere is, quite simply, the most astonishing result in all of modern mathematics. In 1924, two Polish mathematicians, Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, published a theorem that most people, upon first hearing it, assume must be a joke. They proved that it is possible to take a solid three-dimensional sphere, cut it into a finite number of pieces, as few as 5, and then reassemble those pieces using only rotations and translations. No stretching, no bending, no adding of material, into two complete solid spheres, each one identical in size to the original. You start with one ball. You cut it up. You rearrange the pieces. You end up with two balls. You have doubled the volume of matter without adding a single atom. The Banach-Tarski paradox, as it came to be known, is not a physical claim. You cannot actually do this with an orange. The pieces into which the sphere must be divided are not the kind of pieces you could cut with a knife, or with a laser, or with any physical tool, no matter how precise. They are what mathematicians call non-measurable sets, collections of points so fantastically scattered, so infinitely fragmented, so utterly unlike anything that exists in the physical world, that they do not have a well-defined volume at all. They are not chunks. They are not slices. They are clouds of infinitely many individual points, selected according to rules that require the axiom of choice, a foundational principle of set theory that asserts the existence of certain sets without providing any constructive method for building them. The axiom of choice is the quiet enabler of the Banach-Tarski result, and it is itself one of the most controversial principles in mathematics. In its simplest form, it states that given any collection of non-empty sets, it is possible to select one element from each set, even if the collection is infinite, even if there is no rule or formula for making the selections. It sounds almost too obvious to state. Of course, you can pick an element from each set. Just reach in and grab one. But when the collection is uncountably infinite, when there are more sets than there are natural numbers, the act of choosing becomes something that cannot be performed by any explicit procedure, and the sets that the axiom of choice conjures into existence are, in a very real sense, impossible to visualize or construct. They exist only because the axiom says they do. Banach and Tarski use the axiom of choice to decompose a sphere into pieces that have no meaningful volume, pieces that are so bizarre, so unlike anything in ordinary geometry, that the usual rules about volume, the rules that say the volume of the whole equals the sum of the volumes of the parts, simply do not apply. When you reassemble the pieces into two spheres, you have not created matter. You have not doubled volume in any physically meaningful sense. What you have done is exposed a fault line in the relationship between the mathematical concept of volume and the mathematical concept of a set. A fault line that only becomes visible when you allow the axiom of choice to generate objects that the physical world cannot contain. Stefan Banach, who would go on to become one of the founding figures of functional analysis, was a man whose mathematical career had the most unlikely of beginnings. He did not come through the usual academic channels. He was discovered, quite literally, by accident, when a professor named Hugo Steinhaus overheard him discussing advanced mathematics with a friend on a park bench in Krakow. Steinhaus, astonished at the sophistication of the conversation, introduced himself, and the two began a collaboration that would transform modern analysis. Banach would spend most of his career in Lviv, now Lviv in Ukraine, where he and his colleagues would meet at the Scottish Café, scribbling problems into a thick notebook that became legendary in mathematical circles. The notebook survived the Second World War, though many of Banach's colleagues did not. Banach himself died in 1945, weakened by malnutrition and disease during the German occupation, a man whose mind could decompose spheres into impossible fragments, but whose body was subject to the same brutal finitude as any other. Tarski, for his part, fled Poland just before the German invasion and spent the rest of his career at the University of California, Berkeley, where he became one of the most important logicians of the 20th century. He would live until 1983, long enough to see the Banach-Tarski paradox become one of the most famous and most misunderstood results in mathematics, cited by popularizers and sensationalists as proof that mathematics had gone mad, that the foundations were rotten, that a discipline capable of doubling a sphere from nothing was a discipline that had lost all contact with reality. Tarski would have found this irritating. The result was not evidence that mathematics was broken. It was evidence that infinity was strange, and that the tools we use to talk about it, tools like the axiom of choice, carry consequences that our finite minds are not equipped to find comfortable. But you do not need the axiom of choice to find infinite geometry unsettling. You need only a trumpet. Gabriel's horn, also known as Torricelli's trumpet, after the Italian mathematician Evangelista Torricelli, who first described it in 1641, is a shape that can be precisely defined, physically imagined, and rigorously analyzed, and that produces a result so bewildering that Torricelli's own contemporaries refuse to believe it. The construction is simple. Take the curve described by the function 1 divided by x for all values of x greater than or equal to 1. This is a curve that starts at the point where x equals 1 and y equals 1, and as x increases, the curve slopes gently downward, approaching but never touching the horizontal axis, getting closer and closer to 0 but never reaching it, stretching out to the right forever. Now rotate this curve around the horizontal axis, the way a potter rotates a lump of clay on a wheel, and the result is a three-dimensional shape, a horn or trumpet that is wide at one end and tapers to an infinitely thin, infinitely long tube that extends without limit. The shape has finite volume and infinite surface area. Read that again, because it takes a moment to absorb. You can fill Gabriel's horn with paint. It holds a specific, calculable, finite amount, exactly pi cubic units. You can pour paint into the wide end, and it will fill up, level off, and stop, because the interior of the horn, despite extending infinitely far to the right, contains only a finite volume. The taper is so steep, the tube narrows so rapidly, that the total volume converges in the same way that an infinite series of diminishing terms can converge to a finite sum. But you cannot paint the outside. The surface area of Gabriel's horn is infinite. It stretches on forever, and no matter how much paint you have, you will never have enough to coat the exterior. The surface goes on, getting thinner and thinner, but never stopping, and the total area it encompasses is without limit. So you can fill the horn with paint, but you cannot paint it. The inside is finitely large, the outside is infinitely large, and they are the inside and outside of the same object. Torricelli, when he first presented this result, called it an acute hyperbolical solid, and the reaction from the mathematical community was immediate and hostile. How could a finite volume be enclosed by an infinite surface? It seemed absurd. It seemed self-contradictory. If you filled the horn with paint, then the paint would, by necessity, be in contact with the entire interior surface of the horn, which would mean you had painted an infinite surface with a finite volume of paint. Had you not, by filling the horn, already painted it? And if so, how could the surface be infinite if a finite amount of paint could cover it? The resolution, such as it is, lies in the distinction between volume and surface area. Paint, in the mathematical sense, has both. A layer of paint on a surface has a thickness, however small, and that thickness, multiplied by the area, gives a volume. On the interior of Gabriel's horn, the space available for paint shrinks so rapidly that even though the surface area is infinite, the volume of paint required to fill the interior, to cover the interior surface with an ever-thinning layer, remains finite. The paint gets thinner faster than the surface gets bigger. It is a race between two competing infinities, and this time the volume wins. But the fact that the resolution exists does not make the result feel less strange. Gabriel's horn is an object that lives in a perfectly ordinary three-dimensional space, defined by a perfectly ordinary mathematical function. And it behaves in a way that defies every intuition we have about the relationship between insides and outsides, between containers and surfaces, between the finite and the infinite. It is a trumpet that plays a note only mathematics can hear, a note that says, your instincts about space, about volume, about what fits where and how much of it there is, are the instincts of a creature that has never had to deal with the infinite directly. And now that you are dealing with it, those instincts are going to mislead you at every turn. But the deepest and in many ways the most elegant of the infinite paradoxes came not from the hotel or the sphere or the trumpet, but from an Italian who lived 3 centuries before any of them, a man who turned his telescope to the sky and, in the process, turned mathematics in on itself with a question so simple that a child could understand it, and so profound that it took 300 years to answer. Galileo Galilei, in a dialogue published in 1638, 2 years after the Roman Inquisition had sentenced him to house arrest for the crime of suggesting that the earth moved around the sun, turned his restless attention to a problem that had nothing to do with planets or telescopes or the wrath of the church. He asked, "Are there more natural numbers than perfect squares?" The natural numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. The perfect squares are those numbers that result from multiplying a natural number by itself: 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, and so on. Look at the 2 lists, and the answer seems obvious. The perfect squares are a subset of the natural numbers. They are spread out among them, appearing less and less frequently as the numbers grow larger. Between 1 and 10, there are 3 perfect squares: 1, 4, and 9. Between 1 and 100, there are 10. Between 1 and 1,000,000, there are 1,000. The squares become sparser and sparser, occupying an ever smaller fraction of the natural numbers. There must surely be more natural numbers than perfect squares. The squares are missing all those numbers in between: the 2s and the 3s and the 5s and the 6s and the 7s, the vast majority of numbers that are not the product of a number multiplied by itself. And yet, Galileo noticed that you can pair them up. Every natural number has exactly 1 perfect square. 1 pairs with 1, 2 pairs with 4, 3 pairs with 9, 4 pairs with 16, 5 pairs with 25. For every natural number n, there is a corresponding square, n times n. And for every perfect square, there is a corresponding natural number whose square it is. The pairing is exact. It is exhaustive. It leaves no natural number without a partner, and no perfect square without a match. And a 1-to-1 correspondence, as mathematicians would later formalize, is the definition of 2 sets being the same size. The natural numbers and the perfect squares are the same size. The whole is equal to the part. Galileo found this deeply troubling. He concluded that the concepts of greater than, less than, and equal to simply did not apply to infinite collections. That infinity was so fundamentally different from finite quantity that comparing the sizes of infinite sets was meaningless. He was wrong about the conclusion, as it turned out, but he was absolutely right to be troubled, because the phenomenon he had identified, the ability of an infinite set to be placed in 1-to-1 correspondence with a proper subset of itself, would later become the defining property of infinite sets. It is what makes them infinite. It is what separates them from every finite collection in existence. A finite set cannot be matched 1-to-1 with a part of itself. Remove a single element and the set becomes smaller. But an infinite set can lose pieces and remain the same size, can gain pieces and remain the same size, can be doubled and halved and rearranged and recombined without ever changing its fundamental cardinality. It is the mathematical equivalent of a magic purse that never empties, a well that never runs dry, a hotel that is always full and always has room. 2.5 centuries after Galileo, Georg Cantor would pick up where the Italian had left off, and he would go further than anyone had gone before. Cantor did not merely observe that infinite sets could be matched with their parts. He developed an entire arithmetic of the infinite, a rigorous framework for comparing, classifying, and computing with infinite quantities. And in doing so, he discovered something that even Galileo had not suspected: that infinity comes in sizes, that some infinite sets are genuinely, provably, irreducibly larger than others. The set of natural numbers is infinite. The set of real numbers, the numbers that include all the fractions and irrational numbers and decimals that go on forever without repeating, is also infinite. But the real numbers are a bigger infinity. They cannot be paired one-to-one with the natural numbers. There are more of them, not in the loose, colloquial sense, but in the precise, mathematical sense that no function, no matter how cleverly constructed, can establish a one-to-one correspondence between the two sets. Cantor proved this with a technique of breathtaking simplicity called the diagonal argument. Suppose, he said, that someone claims to have a complete list of all real numbers between 0 and 1, each one expressed as an infinite decimal. The list might begin with 0.5, then 0.3141592, then 0.7182818, and so on, stretching downward forever. Cantor showed that no matter what list you produce, you can always construct a new real number that is not on the list by taking the first digit of the first number and changing it, taking the second digit of the second number and changing it, taking the third digit of the third number and changing it, and so on down the diagonal. The resulting number differs from every number on the list in at least one decimal place, which means it is not on the list. But it is a perfectly valid real number between 0 and 1, so the list is incomplete. And since this argument works for any list, no list can ever be complete. The real numbers are uncountable. They outnumber the natural numbers in a way that cannot be remedied by any rearrangement, any cleverness, any amount of shuffling guests between rooms. Cantor did not stop with two sizes of infinity. He proved that for any infinite set, the set of all its subsets, called its power set, is strictly larger, which means there is no largest infinity, that the tower of infinities extends upward without limit, each level inconceivably larger than the one below it, a hierarchy of magnitude so vast that the word vast itself becomes laughably inadequate. The infinity of the natural numbers, the smallest infinity, is called Aleph No. The infinity of the real numbers is larger. The infinity of the set of all functions, from the reals to the reals, is larger still. And above that, and above that, and above that, forever, with no ceiling, no final floor, no room at the top of the infinite hotel where the counting finally stops. The mathematical establishment of the late 19th century reacted to Cantor's work with a mixture of awe and horror. Henri Poincaré, one of the greatest mathematicians of the age, called it a disease from which mathematics would one day recover. Leopold Kronecker, a powerful and conservative mathematician who believed that only the natural numbers were truly real, spent years attacking Cantor's work and undermining his career. Calling him a corrupter of youth and a charlatan, the hostility was not merely intellectual. It was personal, sustained, and cruel, and it contributed to the severe depression that plagued Cantor throughout his later life. He spent his final years in and out of a sanatorium in Halle, Germany, increasingly isolated, increasingly fragile, a man who had seen further into the nature of infinity than anyone before him, and who had been punished for it by the very community he had tried to enlighten. He died on the 6th of January, 1918, in the sanatorium, malnourished and alone, 6 months before the end of the war that was tearing his continent apart. But Cantor was right. His work survived his suffering and outlasted his critics. The arithmetic of infinite sets, transfinite arithmetic as he called it, is now a cornerstone of modern mathematics. as fundamental and as indispensable as the geometry of Euclid or the calculus of Newton and Leibniz. And the paradoxes that his work illuminated, the paradoxes of Galileo and Hilbert and Banach and Tarski, are not flaws in the theory. They are features of the landscape, the inevitable consequences of a mathematical universe that is far stranger, far more extravagant, far more wildly, recklessly, exuberantly large than the finite minds that inhabit it could ever have expected. And so you lie here, in the smallest hours, in a room that is finite and a body that is finite, and a life that is by any standard heartbreakingly brief, and you think about a hotel with no last room, and a trumpet that can be filled but not painted, and a ball that can be cut into 5 pieces and reassembled into 2, and you wonder what kind of universe it is that permits such things. Not a physical universe, perhaps. The Banach-Tarski sphere cannot be carved from marble. Gabriel's horn cannot be forged from brass. Hilbert's hotel cannot be built from concrete and steel. But the mathematical universe, the universe of pure structure and pure relation, the universe that exists nowhere and is true everywhere, that universe contains all of these things and more, infinitely more. And the fact that your mind can visit it, can wander its corridors and peer into its rooms and come back with stories that sound like the ravings of a fever dream, but are actually the most rigorously established truths in all of human knowledge, that fact is itself a kind of paradox, a small thing containing a vastness it has no right to contain, a finite vessel holding an infinite sea. The rooms go on forever. The corridors do not end. And somewhere far down the hallway, past the room where you are lying, past the room where someone very like you is also lying awake and also thinking about infinity, past all the rooms that have numbers and all the rooms that do not, the hotel stretches on into a darkness that is not empty but full of guests and questions and numbers that no one has counted yet. And the manager is still at his desk, patient and tireless, ready to make room for one more. And perhaps it is the thought of that patient manager, sitting at his desk in the small hours while the infinite corridor stretches out behind him, that turns the mind from the abstract to the physical, from the paradoxes of pure mathematics to the paradoxes of the universe itself, the actual, tangible, measurable universe of atoms and light and forces and fields, the universe that you are lying inside of right now, the one your body is made of, the one your brain is using to think these thoughts. Because if the infinite hotel taught us that mathematics behaves in ways our intuitions cannot follow, the 20th century would deliver an even more unsettling lesson, that the physical world, the world we can touch and see and measure, the world we built civilization on the assumption that we understood, behaves in ways that make the infinite hotel look almost sensible by comparison. The trouble began, as trouble so often does in physics, with a very small thing. Not a planet, not a star, not any of the grand, majestic objects that had occupied the attention of Newton and Kepler and Galileo. The trouble began with an atom, with the behavior of particles so small that no human eye would ever see them, particles that make up everything you have ever touched and everything you have ever been. And that turned out, when physicists finally developed the tools to study them, to operate according to rules so bizarre, so alien, so thoroughly incompatible with everyday experience, that the scientists who discovered those rules spent the rest of their lives arguing about what they meant. By the 1920s, the new science of quantum mechanics had produced a mathematical framework of extraordinary precision and predictive power. It could calculate the energy levels of atoms, predict the outcomes of experiments, and explain phenomena that classical physics could not touch. It worked. It worked spectacularly. And the people who had built it were, to a man and woman profoundly disturbed by what it said about reality. The central strangeness of quantum mechanics, the thing that separates it from every previous scientific theory, is this. Before you measure a quantum system, the system does not have a definite state. A particle does not have a definite position. It does not have a definite speed. It does not have a definite spin. It exists in what the theory calls a superposition, a combination of all the possible states it could be in, each one weighted by a probability. It is not that we do not know which state the particle is in, the way we might not know whether a coin hidden under a cup is heads or tails. The particle is not in any particular state. It is in all of them, simultaneously, in a way that has no analog in the world of tables and chairs and coffee cups. And then you measure it. You look. You set up a detector, or a photographic plate, or any apparatus that interacts with the particle in a way that produces a definite outcome. And the moment you do, the superposition collapses. The particle is now in one specific state. It has a position, it has a speed, it has a spin. The act of measurement, the act of looking, has forced the system to choose, to resolve its indeterminacy into something concrete and particular and real. This was, and remains, the most controversial claim in the history of science. Not the mathematics, which is not in dispute. The mathematics works. Every experiment ever conducted has confirmed the predictions of quantum mechanics with an accuracy that borders on the absurd. The controversy is about what the mathematics means. What does it mean for a particle to be in a superposition? What does it mean for a measurement to collapse that superposition? What is special about measurement? What counts as looking? And it was in the attempt to answer these questions, or rather, in the attempt to show how deeply unanswerable they were, that a physicist with a fondness for cats set up the most famous thought experiment in the history of science. Erwin Schrödinger was an Austrian, born in Vienna in 1887 to a family of comfortable means and considerable intellectual ambition. He was educated in the classical European tradition, fluent in several languages, well-read in philosophy, and possessed of a personal life that was, by the standards of any era, spectacularly complicated. He kept multiple lovers simultaneously, often with the knowledge and sometimes with the cooperation of his wife Anne-Marie, and he produced some of his best work during periods of intense romantic entanglement, a fact that his biographers have noted with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1933 for his development of wave mechanics, the mathematical framework that describes quantum systems as waves of probability, and he spent the rest of his career trying to understand, and in many ways trying to resist, the implications of his own creation. Schrödinger did not like what quantum mechanics was saying about reality. He did not like superposition. He did not like the idea that particles existed in indeterminate states until they were observed. And he particularly did not like the interpretation championed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, the so-called Copenhagen interpretation, which held that the act of measurement was not merely a practical limitation, but a fundamental feature of reality, that quantum indeterminacy was not a gap in our knowledge, but a truth about the world, that asking what a particle is doing before you measure it is not a question that has an answer, because the particle is not doing anything. It is waiting to be asked. Schrödinger found this intolerable, not because it was mathematically wrong, it was not, but because it seemed to him to draw an arbitrary line between the quantum world of atoms and particles, where superposition reigned, and the classical world of everyday objects, where things were always in definite states. Where was that line? What made it special? At what point did quantum weirdness stop and ordinary reality begin? And if no such line existed, if the rules of quantum mechanics applied to everything, to cats and tables and human beings, just as they applied to electrons and photons, then what would the world look like? He answered the question in 1935, in a paper that was meant as a critique, as a reductio ad absurdum of the Copenhagen interpretation, a demonstration of its logical consequences, pushed to the point of obvious absurdity. The thought experiment he devised was not complicated. It did not require advanced mathematics. It required only a cat, a box, and a very particular kind of cruelty. Place a cat in a sealed steel chamber. Inside the chamber, place a small amount of radioactive material, a substance so minute that there is an exactly 50% chance that one of its atoms will decay within 1 hour. If the atom decays, it triggers a Geiger counter, which activates a relay, which breaks a flask of hydrocyanic acid, which kills the cat. If the atom does not decay, the flask remains intact, and the cat lives. Seal the chamber. Wait 1 hour. Do not open it. According to quantum mechanics, the radioactive atom, after 1 hour, is in a superposition of two states, decayed and not decayed. It is both simultaneously, in the precise mathematical sense that quantum theory describes, but the atom is linked by the Geiger counter and the relay and the flask to the cat. If the atom is in a superposition of decayed and not decayed, and the cat's fate depends on the atom's state, then the cat too must be in a superposition. The cat is alive and dead, not alive or dead, not alive with some probability, and dead with some probability. Alive and dead simultaneously, in the same way that the atom is decayed and not decayed, in the same way that an electron can be in two places at once, in the same way that quantum mechanics insists that unobserved systems exist in all their possible states until the moment observation forces them to choose. And then you open the box, and the cat is either alive or dead, not both, one or the other. The superposition has collapsed. The act of looking, of opening the lid and peering inside, has resolved the indeterminacy and produced a definite outcome. But what was the cat before you looked? Was it really both alive and dead? Was it in a genuine superposition? A quantum zombie hovering in the liminal space between life and death? Or was the cat always in a definite state, and the superposition was merely a reflection of your ignorance, a statement about what you knew rather than what was real? Schrödinger intended the thought experiment to be a knockout blow against the Copenhagen interpretation. The idea of a cat being simultaneously alive and dead was so manifestly absurd, so obviously at odds with everything we know about cats and boxes and the observable world, that it should, he felt, demonstrate the inadequacy of treating superposition as anything more than a mathematical convenience. No one actually believes the cat is both alive and dead. Therefore, no one should believe that the electron is both here and there. The quantum formalism is a tool for calculating probabilities, not a description of reality. But the Copenhagen school did not fold. Bohr and his allies held their ground, arguing that the thought experiment, far from refuting their interpretation, actually illustrated it perfectly. The cat is not in a superposition, they said, because the cat is a macroscopic object that interacts with its environment in ways that destroy quantum coherence, a process now called decoherence. The superposition of the atom is real, but by the time the chain of events reaches the cat, the system has already been measured, in effect, by the countless particles in the Geiger counter and the relay and the flask and the air molecules in the chamber. The cat is never in a superposition because the environment has already collapsed the wave function long before you open the box. This is a reasonable response, and decoherence theory, which was developed in detail in the 1970s and 1980s, provides a robust physical mechanism for understanding why quantum effects are not visible at macroscopic scales. But it does not quite solve the problem, because decoherence explains why superpositions become undetectable and why they are, for all practical purposes, impossible to observe in large systems. But it does not explain why a definite outcome occurs. It explains why the cat appears to be either alive or dead, but it does not explain why it is this particular outcome rather than the other. The mathematics of decoherence still describes a superposition, just one that is spread across the system and its environment in a way that makes the different branches effectively invisible to each other. The cat is still, in the mathematical formalism, alive and dead. You just cannot tell. But the cat, for all its fame, is not alone in its sealed chamber. It has company. Because if the quantum measurement problem is troubling when the observer is a physicist opening a box, it becomes positively vertiginous when you place the observer inside the experiment itself. This was the contribution of Eugene Wigner, a Hungarian-American physicist of formidable intellect who had won his own Nobel Prize for contributions to nuclear physics and the theory of symmetry. Wigner, like Schrödinger, was troubled by the measurement problem, and in 1961 he proposed an extension of the cat experiment that has come to be known as Wigner's friend. The setup is this. Wigner's friend, a fellow physicist, is inside the laboratory. She performs a measurement on a quantum system, say the spin of an electron, which can be either up or down. Before she measures, the electron is in a superposition of both states. She measures, the superposition collapses. She sees a definite result. The electron is spin up, or the electron is spin down. From her perspective, the measurement is complete. She has a definite outcome. The world is in a definite state. But Wigner is outside the laboratory. He has not opened the door. He has not spoken to his friend. He has not received any information about the outcome of the measurement. From Wigner's perspective, the laboratory, its contents, the electron, the measuring apparatus, and his friend constitute a quantum system that has not yet been observed. And according to quantum mechanics, an unobserved system is in a superposition. Wigner's friend, from Wigner's perspective, is in a superposition of having seen spin up and having seen spin down. She is in both states simultaneously. Her conscious experience, her definite perception of one particular outcome, is, from outside the laboratory, as indeterminate as the electron before it was measured. Now Wigner opens the door. He asks his friend what she saw. She tells him the superposition, from Wigner's perspective, collapses. But what about the period before he opened the door? Was his friend really in a superposition? Did she have a definite experience or not? She will insist that she did, that she saw a result the moment she measured the electron, that she was never in any kind of indeterminate state. But Wigner's formalism says otherwise, and the formalism is the same formalism that has been confirmed by every experiment ever conducted. The paradox is this: whose perspective is correct? If Wigner's friend has a definite experience before Wigner opens the door, then the quantum description, which assigns her a superposition, is incomplete. It fails to capture something real about her state. But if the quantum description is complete, and the friend really is in a superposition until Wigner observes her, then her definite experience, her conscious perception of one outcome, is somehow not sufficient to collapse the wave function. Consciousness does not count as observation, or at least not everyone's consciousness counts, or at least not until someone else observes the observer. Wigner himself initially drew a radical conclusion from his thought experiment. He suggested that consciousness was special, that it was the act of conscious observation and nothing else that collapsed the wave function, that the mind played a fundamental role in determining physical reality. This was a deeply controversial position, and Wegener eventually moved away from it, but the idea has persisted in popular culture and in certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, where it has been embraced by mystics and New Age thinkers and authors of best-selling books about how you can manifest your desires by thinking positive thoughts, a development that would have made Wegener, who was a rigorous and deeply serious physicist, extremely uncomfortable. The more sober responses to Wegener's friend have been varied, and none of them entirely satisfying. The Copenhagen interpretation tends to avoid the problem by insisting that quantum mechanics is a tool for predicting the results of measurements, and that questions about what is really happening between measurements are not meaningful. Questions. The many worlds interpretation, proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957, sidesteps the paradox entirely by denying that wave function collapse ever occurs. In Everett's picture, every possible outcome of every quantum measurement actually happens, but in separate, non-interacting branches of reality. When Wegener's friend measures the electron, the universe splits. In one branch, she sees spin up. In another, she sees spin down. Both branches are equally real. Both friends have definite experiences. Wegener, before he opens the door, is himself in a superposition of branches, and when he opens the door, the branches diverge further, each Wegener meeting the friend who corresponds to his branch. No collapse, no mystery. Just an unimaginably vast, ever-branching tree of parallel realities, each one as solid and as complete as the one you are lying in right now. Whether the many worlds interpretation is comforting or terrifying depends, much like Parfit's view of personal identity, on your temperament. If you are the sort of person who finds comfort in completeness, in the idea that nothing is ever lost, that every possibility is realized somewhere, then the many worlds are a kind of paradise, an infinite hotel in which every version of you has a room and no story is ever left untold. But if you are the sort of person who finds meaning in uniqueness, in the idea that this life, this moment, this particular arrangement of atoms and memories and small kindnesses is the only one there is, then the many worlds are a kind of horror, a vast dilution of significance in which everything matters because everything happens, and therefore nothing matters at all. And it is from this branching, splitting, endlessly proliferating vision of reality that the strangest and most disturbing of the quantum paradoxes emerges. It is not, strictly speaking, a paradox in the logical sense. It does not contain a contradiction, but it describes a consequence of quantum mechanics so deeply alien to human experience, so fundamentally at odds with the way we understand life and death and consciousness, that it deserves the name. Quantum immortality was first described by the physicist Max Tegmark in 1998, building on ideas that Everett himself had hinted at but never fully developed. The setup begins with a variation of Schrödinger's cat, but this time you are the cat. You sit in a room. In front of you is a device connected to a quantum random number generator, a device that measures the spin of an electron and, based on the outcome, either fires a gun or does not. Spin up, the gun fires. Spin down, it does not. You press the button. According to the many worlds interpretation, the universe splits. In one branch, the gun fires and you die. In the other, the gun does not fire and you live. From the perspective of an outside observer, there is a 50% chance that you are dead. But from your perspective, the situation is entirely different. You cannot experience being dead. Consciousness does not persist after death. In the branch where the gun fires, there is no you to observe the outcome. The only branches in which you continue to have experiences are the branches in which you survive. And so, from your subjective perspective, the gun never fires. You press the button again. The universe splits again. Again, the only branch you experience is the one in which you survive. Again and again and again, an infinite succession of button presses, an infinite series of branching universes, and in every single one that you are aware of, you are alive. The implication is vertiginous. If the many worlds interpretation is correct, and if consciousness can only exist in branches where the conscious being is alive, then from a first-person perspective, you can never die. Not because you are immortal in any branch, but because your subjective experience is always routed by the logic of branching and the impossibility of dead observation to the branches in which you continue to exist. The branches in which you die are real. Other people observe your death. Other people mourn you. But you do not experience those branches because there is no you in them to do the experiencing. Your consciousness threads its way through the ever-branching tree of reality like water, finding a path down a hillside, always flowing toward the futures in which it still exists, bypassing the dead ends, the collapsed tunnels, the branches that lead to darkness and silence. Tegmark himself is careful to note that this does not mean you would notice anything strange. In practice, quantum events are not the only source of mortal danger. Car accidents, disease, and old age. These are macroscopic phenomena that do not admit neat quantum splitting into survival and death. You would not live forever in any branch. You would simply find, in the branches where you persist, that a series of increasingly unlikely events conspired to keep you alive. The quantum random number generator always landed on the safe outcome. The disease went into improbable remission. The car swerved at the last moment. Each individual event would be unlikely, but not impossible. And the accumulation of unlikely survivals would itself be unremarkable from the inside, because the branches in which you did not survive are branches you cannot access. The idea is almost certainly untestable, which places it at the very edge of what can meaningfully be called science. It is a logical consequence of a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, an interpretation that is itself neither proved nor disproved, but merely one of several competing frameworks for making sense of the same mathematics. And the vast majority of physicists do not take quantum immortality literally, regarding it as a thought experiment that illustrates the strangeness of the many worlds interpretation rather than a genuine prediction about the nature of consciousness. But in the late hours of the night, when the boundary between physics and philosophy grows thin and the mind wanders freely through ideas it would normally keep at arm's length, the thought has a peculiar power. The idea that you are always, from your own perspective, the survivor, that the version of you experiencing this moment is, by definition, the version that made it through, that every near miss in your life, every illness you recovered from, every accident you narrowly avoided, every morning you woke up when you might not have, could be, in some interpretation of the physics, not luck, but necessity, the inevitable consequence of a consciousness that can only exist in the branches where it continues. It is not true, or at least we cannot know if it is true. And even if the many worlds interpretation is correct, the mechanism by which consciousness selects branches, if selection is even the right word, remains entirely mysterious, a problem at least as hard as the measurement problem it was designed to solve. But the image stays with you, the cat in the box, alive and dead, waiting for someone to look, the friend in the laboratory, certain of what she saw but uncertain of what she is, and you, lying here in the dark, in a universe that may be one of an infinite number, the branch in which your eyes are still open, in which your heart is still beating, in which the question of what happens when you close your eyes and stop observing is not an abstract philosophical puzzle, but the most intimate and immediate question there is. The electron spins. The branches fork. And in this particular branch, in this particular room, on this particular night, you are still here, still thinking, still holding on to consciousness by the thinnest of threads, a thread that quantum mechanics says is not a thread at all, but a river. A river that flows in every direction at once, and you are riding it, carried along by a current you did not choose and cannot control, toward a morning that, in at least one branch of the endlessly splitting universe, is already waiting for you. But the current carries you somewhere unexpected now, away from the vast and the cosmic, away from the splitting universes and the indeterminate particles, and back to something smaller, closer, more familiar, back to the world of choices and chances, of odds and outcomes, of the ordinary, everyday calculations that human beings make without thinking, calculations that turn out, when you examine them closely, to be catastrophically, embarrassingly, stubbornly wrong. Because if quantum mechanics revealed that reality is stranger than we imagined, the paradoxes of probability reveal something arguably more humiliating, that we do not even understand the simple parts, that the human mind, so brilliant at language and pattern and story, is almost comically bad at reasoning about chance, that our intuitions about likelihood, about randomness, about the probability of perfectly ordinary events are not merely imprecise, but systematically, predictably, spectacularly mistaken. And nowhere is this more vividly demonstrated than on a television game show that aired in the United States for nearly 3 decades, was hosted by a man in a tailored suit, and was watched by millions of people who had no idea they were witnessing one of the most fiercely debated probability puzzles of the 20th century. The show was called Let's Make a Deal, and it was hosted by Monty Hall, a Canadian-born entertainer with a gift for showmanship and an instinct for dramatic timing. The format was simple. A contestant was presented with 3 doors. Behind one was a prize, a new car, say. Behind the other 2 were goats. The contestant chose a door. Then Monty, who knew what was behind each door, would open one of the remaining doors, always revealing a goat. The contestant was then given a choice: stick with their original door or switch to the other unopened door. Should you switch? The answer, which has been proved mathematically, confirmed by computer simulations, and verified by every probabilist who has ever examined the problem, is yes. You should always switch. Switching gives you a 2/3 chance of winning the car. Staying gives you a 1/3 chance. The odds are not equal. They are not even close. And yet the overwhelming majority of people, including a startling number of professional mathematicians when the problem first gained widespread attention, believe, with a confidence that borders on indignation, that it makes no difference, that the odds are 50-50, that once Monty has opened a door and revealed a goat, you are left with 2 doors, one hiding a car and one hiding a goat, and the probability of each is obviously, self-evidently, inarguably 1 in 2. They are wrong, and the reason they are wrong is both simple and deeply counterintuitive, and it reveals something important about the way human beings process new information. When you first choose a door, you have a 1 in 3 chance of having chosen the car. This means there is a 2 in 3 chance that the car is behind one of the other 2 doors. Monty then opens one of those 2 doors and shows you a goat. This is the moment where intuition goes wrong, because it feels as though Monty has given you no information, as though showing you a goat behind a door you did not choose is trivial, meaningless, something you could have guessed would happen. But Monty has given you information, and the information is crucial because Monty knows where the car is. He did not open a door at random. He deliberately chose a door with a goat. And this deliberate choice changes the probability distribution in a way that is invisible to intuition but perfectly clear to mathematics. Before Monty opens the door, the 2/3 probability is spread across both of the doors you did not choose. After Monty opens one of them, revealing a goat, that entire 2/3 probability concentrates onto the single remaining door. Your original door still has its original 1/3 chance. The other door now carries 2/3. Switching doubles your odds. The way to see this most clearly is to imagine a version of the game with 100 doors instead of 3. You choose one. Monty, who knows where the car is, opens 98 of the remaining 99 doors, all revealing goats. He leaves one door closed. Would you switch? Of course you would. Your original choice had a 1 in 100 chance of being correct. The other door, the one Monty so conspicuously left closed while opening every other possibility, is almost certainly hiding the car. Monty's act of elimination has taken all the probability that was spread across 99 doors and funneled it into one. The 3-door version works exactly the same way, just with less dramatic numbers. The Monty Hall problem became a sensation in 1990, when Marilyn Vaz-Savant, a columnist for Parade magazine who was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for having the highest recorded IQ, published the correct solution in her column. The response was extraordinary. Approximately 10,000 readers wrote in to tell her she was wrong. Many of them were mathematicians. Many of them were professors. Many of them were very, very angry. One letter from a PhD at a major university read, "You blew it, and you blew it big. Since you seem to have difficulty grasping the basic principle at work here, I'll explain it to you. After the host reveals a goat, you now have a 1 in 2 chance of being right. Whether you change your selection or not, the odds are the same. There is enough condescension to fill a seminary. Vos-Savant was right. The professors were wrong. And the fury they expressed was not merely intellectual. It was emotional, visceral, personal. The fury of people who felt that their competence had been challenged and who could not, despite their expertise, see the flaw in their own reasoning. The Monty Hall problem is not a trick. It is not a riddle. It is a straightforward exercise in conditional probability, and the fact that it defeats nearly everyone on first encounter, including people who should know better, tells us something profound about the gap between mathematical truth and human cognition. We are not built for probability. We are built for narrative. We see patterns where there are none. We assign significance to coincidence. We confuse the plausible with the probable and the surprising with the unlikely. And when the mathematics contradicts our gut, we do not doubt our gut. We doubt the mathematics. The Monty Hall problem endures not because it is difficult, the proof fits on a napkin, but because it is a mirror, a clean and simple surface in which we can see with uncomfortable clarity the shape of our own irrationality. And that irrationality does not confine itself to game shows. It follows us into rooms and offices and classrooms, into every situation where we are called upon to estimate the likelihood of something happening. And it leads us astray with a reliability that would be impressive if it were not so costly. Consider a room with 23 people in it. Not a large room, not a crowd. A modest gathering, a classroom, a dinner party. What is the probability that at least 2 of those 23 people share a birthday? Not a specific birthday, not your birthday. Just any 2 people in the room, born on the same day of the same month, regardless of the year. Most people, when asked this question, estimate the probability as low, very low. After all, there are 365 days in a year and only 23 people in the room. The ratio feels impossibly sparse. There are so many possible birthdays and so few people that a match seems like a remarkable coincidence, the kind of thing you would notice and comment on, the kind of thing that would make you say, "What are the odds?" The odds are about 50%. In a room of 23 people, there is roughly a 1 in 2 chance that at least 2 of them share a birthday. By the time you reach 50 people, the probability exceeds 97%. By 70, it is virtually certain. The birthday paradox, as it is called, is not a paradox in the strict sense. It does not contain a contradiction. The mathematics is straightforward, involving nothing more exotic than basic combinatorics. The reason the result feels paradoxical is that human beings are very bad at computing the number of possible pairings in a group. When you hear 23 people and 365 days, your mind compares the small number to the large number and concludes that a match is unlikely. But the question is not whether any particular person shares your birthday. The question is whether any pair of people in the room shares a birthday. And in a group of 23, there are 253 possible pairs, a number that is considerably larger than intuition suggests. The calculation works by computing the probability of the opposite outcome, that all 23 people have different birthdays, and subtracting from 1, the first person can have any birthday. The second person must have a different one, which has a probability of 364 out of 365. The third person must differ from both, which is 363 out of 365, and so on, each new person slightly reducing the pool of available dates. Multiply all these probabilities together, and the result drops below 50% surprisingly quickly, because each new person is being compared not to one existing birthday, but to all of them. And the number of comparisons grows much faster than the number of people. The birthday paradox has applications far beyond party tricks. In cryptography, it underpins what is known as the birthday attack, a method for finding collisions in hash functions, which are mathematical tools used to secure everything from passwords to financial transactions. The insight is the same. When you are looking for a match between any 2 items in a large set, you need far fewer samples than intuition suggests. A hash function that produces 1 trillion possible outputs sounds secure. But the birthday paradox tells us that a collision, 2 different inputs producing the same output, can be found with a number of attempts roughly equal to the square root of the total possibilities, a vastly smaller number. What sounds impregnable to the gut is merely inconvenient to the mathematics. But if the birthday paradox reveals that our intuitions about coincidence are unreliable, Simpson's paradox reveals something deeper and more troubling, that our intuitions about evidence itself can be fundamentally misleading. That data, honest data, correctly measured and accurately reported, can tell you one thing when you look at it as a whole and the exact opposite when you break it into parts. And that both views, the whole and the parts, are mathematically correct. The paradox takes its name from Edward Simpson, a British statistician who described it in a technical paper in 1951, though the phenomenon had been observed by others before him, most notably by the Scottish statistician George Udny Ewell in 1903. But names in mathematics often attach to the person who made the concept famous rather than the person who discovered it first, a pattern that is itself a kind of injustice that recurs with depressing regularity across the history of ideas. The classic illustration involves a medical treatment. Suppose a new drug is being tested against an old one. You run a trial with 2 groups, men and women. Among the men, the new drug performs better than the old drug. A higher percentage of men recover when given the new treatment. Among the women, the new drug also performs better. A higher percentage of women recover with the new treatment. The new drug is better for men and better for women. It is better for every subgroup in the study. And yet, when you combine the data, when you pool all the patients into a single group without distinguishing by sex, the old drug performs better overall. The new drug, which is superior in every subgroup, is inferior in the aggregate. This is not a trick. It is not a mistake. It is not the result of bad data or sloppy methodology. It is a real statistical phenomenon, and it occurs because the subgroups are of different sizes and the base rates are different. Perhaps many more men received the new drug than women, and perhaps men had a lower recovery rate overall. The disproportionate representation of men in the new drug group drags down the aggregate numbers, even though the drug performed better within each subgroup. The aggregate result is not wrong, but it is misleading because it conceals the structure of the data, the lurking variable that, once you account for it, reverses the conclusion. Simpson's paradox appeared memorably in a real-world controversy involving admissions at the University of California, Berkeley in 1973. A study of graduate admissions data showed that men were admitted at a significantly higher rate than women, which appeared to demonstrate a clear bias against female applicants. But when the data was broken down by department, the pattern reversed. In most individual departments, women were admitted at a slightly higher rate than men. The aggregate bias was an artifact of the application patterns. Women tended to apply to more competitive departments with lower admission rates, while men applied disproportionately to less competitive departments with higher rates. The university was not discriminating against women. The aggregate data merely looked as though it was, because it was blending together departments with very different levels of selectivity. The paradox is not merely a statistical curiosity. It is a warning, a flashing light in the machinery of reasoning that says, aggregation can deceive you. The whole can tell a different story from its parts, and neither story is more true than the other. The choice of which story to believe depends on which question you are asking, which variables you think are relevant, which level of analysis captures the reality you care about. And these are not mathematical decisions. They are judgments, human judgments, shaped by context and values and the kind of knowledge that no formula can provide. For someone lying awake in the dark, turning ideas over in the slow rotation of a mind approaching sleep, Simpson's paradox has a peculiar resonance. How many times in a life do you look at the whole and miss the parts? How many conclusions have you drawn from aggregated experience, from the overall shape of a relationship or a career or a year, that would reverse themselves if you looked more closely, if you broke the experience into its components and examined each one separately? The whole says one thing, the pieces say another, and the truth is not in either view but in the act of holding both, in the discipline of looking at the forest and the trees and understanding that they can, without contradiction, tell you opposite things about the same landscape. But the paradoxes of probability do not only confound us when we look at data, they confound us when we look at ourselves, at our own place in the world, at the simple question of how we compare to the people around us. And here the mathematics delivers a conclusion that is, depending on your mood, either humbling or quietly devastating. The friendship paradox was first described by the sociologist Scott Feld in 1991, and it states, with mathematical precision, that on average, your friends have more friends than you do. This is not a comment about your personality. It is not a reflection of your social skills, or your likability, or the strength of your connections. It is a structural property of networks, all networks, a mathematical inevitability that arises from the way connections are distributed. The reason is simple, once you see it, and almost impossible to intuit before it is explained. People with many friends appear on more people's friend lists than people with few friends. This is obvious, almost tautological. If someone has 1,000 friends, they appear as a friend in 1,000 people's networks. If someone has 2 friends, they appear in 2. When you pick a random person and look at their friends, the friends you see are disproportionately likely to be the high connection people, the social hubs, the people with many friends. because those people are, by virtue of their many connections, overrepresented in the sample. Your friends are not a random sample of the population. They are a biased sample, biased toward people who have more friends, because having more friends is precisely what makes someone more likely to be your friend. The result is that for most people, the average number of friends that their friends have is higher than the number of friends they themselves have. Not for everyone. The people at the very top of the social hierarchy are exceptions, but for the majority. Most people are, in a precise statistical sense, less popular than their friends. Feld's proof is elegant and requires nothing more than basic network theory, but the implications are uncomfortable. Social media has made the friendship paradox visible in a way that was not possible before. When you scroll through your feed and see your friends posting photographs of their gatherings, their trips, their social events, you are looking at a biased sample. You are seeing the people with the most connections, the people who are most active, the people who are, by the mathematics of networks, likely to have more friends and more social engagements than you. The feeling that everyone else has a richer social life than you do is not, it turns out, purely a product of insecurity or envy. It is a product of mathematics, a structural illusion built into the topology of every social network, online and off. The friendship paradox extends beyond friendships. Your co-authors, on average, have more co-authors than you do. Your sexual partners, on average, have had more sexual partners than you have. Your Twitter followers, on average, have more followers than you do. In every network, in every context where connections are unevenly distributed, the same bias applies. You are almost certainly below the average of your own connections. Not because you are deficient, but because the average is pulled upward by the hubs, by the outliers, by the heavily connected nodes that appear in everyone's network and inflate the numbers for everyone they touch. It is, in its way, a paradox of perspective. You are comparing yourself to a sample that is structurally biased against you, and the comparison will always make you feel smaller than you are. The universe is not picking on you. The mathematics is. But if the friendship paradox shows that individual perspective can be misleading, the final paradox of probability reaches into something larger, into the design of systems and cities and roads, and demonstrates that improvement can make things worse. Dietrich Brace was a German mathematician who, in 1968, published a paper describing a phenomenon in traffic networks that has since been observed in electrical grids, computer networks, mechanical systems, and even the design of sports teams. The phenomenon is this: adding a new road to a traffic network can increase the travel time for every driver. Removing a road from a traffic network can decrease it. This is not a result of poor planning or bad engineering. It is a mathematical property of networks in which each participant is acting rationally, choosing the route that minimizes their own travel time, without coordinating with anyone else. It occurs because individual rationality and collective optimality are not the same thing, because what is best for each person, taken one at a time, is not necessarily best for everyone taken together. The setup Brace described involves a simple network with two routes from a starting point to a destination. Each route has two segments, one with a fixed travel time and one with a travel time that depends on the volume of traffic. Drivers distribute themselves between the two routes in a way that equalizes travel times, with the network reaching an equilibrium in which no individual driver can improve their journey by switching routes. Now add a new road, a shortcut connecting the midpoints of the two routes with a very fast travel time. You might expect this to help. More options should mean more flexibility, and more flexibility should mean shorter journeys. But what happens is the opposite. The new road tempts drivers to switch to a hybrid route that uses the fastest segment of each original route connected by the shortcut. Each driver, acting rationally, takes this hybrid route because it appears faster than either original route. But as all drivers converge on the same path, the traffic-dependent segments become congested, and the total travel time for everyone increases. The new road, which should have helped, has made things worse, not because it is a bad road, but because its existence changes the behavior of every driver in the network, and the collective result of all those individually rational decisions is a collectively irrational outcome. Brace's paradox has been observed in the real world. In Seoul, South Korea, the demolition of a major highway in 2003 reduced traffic congestion in the surrounding area. In Stuttgart, Germany, closing certain streets has been shown to improve traffic flow. In New York City, traffic engineers have considered removing roads to ease gridlock, a proposition that sounds insane until you understand the mathematics. The counterintuitive lesson of Brace is that in interconnected systems, less can be more, that adding capacity can reduce performance, that the obvious improvement is sometimes the precise thing that makes the system worse. The paradox generalizes far beyond traffic. In electrical circuits, adding a wire can reduce the overall current flow. In game theory, giving a player additional options can make them worse off. In economics, increasing the supply of a resource can, under certain market structures, decrease the total welfare of the participants. The thread that runs through all these examples is the same. When individuals optimize for themselves within a system, the system as a whole can end up in a state that is worse for everyone than the state it was in before the improvement was made. The invisible hand, which Adam Smith trusted to guide individual self-interest toward collective benefit, sometimes points in the wrong direction, and the road that looks like a shortcut sometimes leads to a traffic jam that would not have existed without it. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of all these paradoxes of probability and statistics, these puzzles of doors and birthdays and friends and roads. The lesson is not that mathematics is unreliable. Mathematics is the most reliable thing we have. The lesson is that we are unreliable, that the instrument we use to navigate the world, the human mind, with its love of stories and its hunger for patterns and its deep, ineradicable need for things to make intuitive sense, is an instrument calibrated for a world that is simpler than the one we actually live in. We evolved to track prey across savannas, to remember faces, to estimate the number of berries on a bush and the distance to the nearest water source. We did not evolve to calculate conditional probabilities, or to account for lurking variables in aggregated data, or to understand the topology of networks, or to anticipate the emergent behavior of systems in which every participant is acting rationally and the collective result is irrational. The Monty Hall problem tells us that we do not understand how new information changes old probabilities. The birthday paradox tells us that we do not understand how quickly coincidences accumulate in groups. Simpson's paradox tells us that we do not understand how aggregation can reverse the direction of evidence. The friendship paradox tells us that we do not understand how network structure biases the samples we see. And Brace's paradox tells us that we do not understand how interconnected systems respond to changes that should, by every common sense measure, make them better. Each one is a small humiliation, a gentle correction administered by the universe to a species that has always believed, with the breezy confidence of a contestant choosing a door, that it knows what it is doing. And each one is also, in its way, a gift, because the correction is available, the mathematics is there, the right answer can be found. You just have to be willing to let go of the gut, to release your grip on the intuition that feels so solid and so trustworthy, and to follow the numbers into the uncomfortable, counterintuitive, deeply strange territory where the truth actually lives. The door is in front of you. You chose it for no particular reason. The host has opened another, showing you what is not behind it. And the question, the only question that matters, is whether you have the courage to switch, to abandon the choice you made when you knew less, and embrace the choice the mathematics says you should make now that you know more. Most people do not switch. Most people cling to their original door, not because the odds favor it, but because changing feels like an admission that the first choice was wrong, and admitting you were wrong, even to yourself, even in the dark, even when no one is watching, is one of the hardest things a human being can do. The odds shift, the numbers rearrange, and somewhere between the door you chose and the door you should have chosen, between the intuition that feels right and the mathematics that is right, the mind loosens its grip, not on the problem, but on the need to solve it, and lets the numbers spin like wheels on a broken clock, going nowhere and everywhere, counting nothing and everything, until the counting itself becomes a kind of rhythm, a kind of pulse, a kind of breathing that is not quite sleep but is no longer quite anything else. And so the counting becomes breathing, and the breathing becomes a kind of waiting, and the waiting carries you forward or backward, or somewhere that is neither, somewhere that has no direction at all, because direction requires time, and time, as it turns out, is the strangest thing of all. Not the time you check on your phone, or the time that passes between meals, or the time it takes for a traffic light to change. The other kind, the deep kind, the kind that physicists write equations about and philosophers lose sleep over. The kind that might, if you push it hard enough, fold back on itself like a piece of paper, bringing the bottom edge up to meet the top, allowing you, at least in principle, at least in theory, at least in the hushed hypothetical territory where thought experiments live and breathe, to travel backward, to arrive at a moment you have already left, to stand in a room you stood in years ago, and face the most dangerous question that the human imagination has ever devised. What happens if you go back in time and kill your own grandfather? The question sounds frivolous. It sounds like the kind of thing a teenager asks at 2 a.m. to annoy a philosophy student. But it has occupied some of the most serious minds of the 20th century, because it is not really a question about grandfathers or murder or family trees. It is a question about causation, about the logical structure of the universe, about whether the past is fixed or malleable, about whether the laws of physics permit closed causal loops, and about what happens when they do. The grandfather paradox, in its standard form, goes like this. Suppose time travel is possible. Suppose you build a machine, or discover a wormhole, or find some other method of transporting yourself into the past. You travel back to a time before your parents were born. You find your grandfather as a young man, before he has met your grandmother, before he has fathered any children, and you kill him. If your grandfather dies before fathering your parent, then your parent is never born. If your parent is never born, then you are never born. If you are never born, you cannot build a time machine. If you cannot build a time machine, you cannot travel back in time. If you cannot travel back in time, you cannot kill your grandfather. If you do not kill your grandfather, he lives, your parent is born, you are born, you build a time machine, you travel back, and you kill him again. And so the loop begins, cause chasing effect chasing cause, a snake swallowing its own tail in a circle that has no beginning and no end, and no stable state in which it can come to rest. The paradox is a reductio ad absurdum of backward time travel. If traveling to the past is possible, then it must be possible to create situations in which an event both happens and does not happen, in which a cause eliminates the conditions for its own existence. And since a thing cannot both happen and not happen, since the universe does not, as far as we know, tolerate outright logical contradictions, the conclusion seems to be that backward time travel is impossible. The universe does not allow it. Not because the engineering is too difficult, but because the logic is too broken. And yet, general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravitation, which is the most accurate description of the structure of space-time that human beings have ever produced, does not obviously forbid it. The equations of general relativity permit solutions that contain what are called closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, allowing an object to return to its own past. The first such solution was discovered in 1949 by Kurt Gödel, the same logician who had shattered the dream of a complete and consistent mathematics 2 decades earlier. Gödel found that in a universe that was rotating, the equations of general relativity permitted time travel, and he presented the finding to his friend Einstein as a birthday gift, which is either the most thoughtful or the most unsettling birthday present in the history of friendship. Einstein was troubled by the result. He acknowledged that the mathematics was correct, but doubted that the physical universe actually contained such features. Our universe, as far as we can tell, is not rotating in the way Gödel's solution required. But other solutions have been found since. Wormholes, cosmic strings, Tipler cylinders, Alcubierre drives, each one a theoretical mechanism by which the fabric of space-time could, in principle, be bent or twisted or punched through in a way that would allow passage into the past. None of these have been built. None of them may be buildable. But the equations permit them, and the question of what happens when the equations meet the grandfather paradox is not one that physics has conclusively answered. The physicist Stephen Hawking proposed what he called the chronology protection conjecture, a hypothesis that the laws of physics, even if they permit closed time-like curves in theory, will always conspire to prevent them in practice, that some as yet undiscovered principle will step in at the last moment to forbid actual time travel, protecting the universe from the logical chaos of grandfather killing and self-erasure. Hawking, characteristically, framed the conjecture with dry wit, saying it made the world safe for historians. But the conjecture remains unproved, a hope dressed up as a hypothesis, and the question of whether the universe permits its own past to be rewritten remains, like the grandfather in his parlor, very much alive. The philosopher David Lewis offered a different resolution, one that does not require forbidding time travel, but instead limits what a time traveler can do. Lewis argued that if you travel to the past, you do not arrive in a version of the past that you can alter. You arrive in the past that already happened. Everything you do in the past is something that already occurred. If you try to kill your grandfather, something will stop you. The gun will jam. You will slip on the stairs. You will lose your nerve. Not because the universe is protecting itself through some mystical mechanism, but because the past is a fact, and facts cannot be changed, and your presence in the past is itself one of those facts, already woven into the fabric of what happened. You were always there. You always failed. The time travel did not change the past. The time travel was part of the past. This is an elegant solution, and it has the virtue of being logically consistent, but it raises its own uncomfortable questions, chief among them the question of free will. If you cannot change the past, if every action you take in the past is predetermined by the fact that it already happened, then in what sense are you free? You are a character in a story that has already been written, walking through scenes that are already set, making choices that are already made. The time traveler, in Lewis's account, is not an agent. They are a prop, a piece of furniture in a room that was arranged long before they arrived. And the loop tightens further with a paradox that is, if anything, even more unsettling than the grandfather problem, because it does not involve violence or death or the erasure of bloodlines. It involves nothing more than a piece of information, a song, a blueprint, a theorem, something that exists, that is real, that has clear and definite properties, and that came from nowhere. The bootstrap paradox, also called a causal loop, describes a situation in which an object or a piece of information is sent back in time, where it becomes the very thing that is eventually sent back. The loop is closed. The thing exists, but no one ever created it. The classic illustration involves a time traveler who goes back to visit Beethoven. Upon arriving in 18th century Bonn, the traveler discovers, to their horror, that Beethoven has no interest in music, that he is, in this timeline, a baker or a cobbler or a man who has never touched a piano. Panicking, the traveler retrieves a book of Beethoven's complete works from their luggage, a book they brought from the future, and hands it to the young man, who studies the compositions, learns them, performs them, becomes famous, and the works are published and preserved and eventually collected into the very book that the traveler brought back in time. Who composed the sonatas? Not the traveler. The traveler merely handed them over. Not Beethoven, not in any creative sense. He copied them from the book. The compositions exist. They are real. They have structure and beauty and emotional depth. But they were never composed. They have no origin. They are their own cause, a loop of information that circles endlessly through time, sustained by nothing but its own existence. The bootstrap paradox does not contain a logical contradiction in the strict sense. It does not produce the kind of irreconcilable conflict that the grandfather paradox does. The loop is self-consistent. Everything that happens is compatible with everything else that happens. But it violates something deeper, something that is not a law of logic, but that feels to the human mind like the principle that every effect has a cause, that everything comes from somewhere, that the chain of creation, if you trace it back far enough, must eventually reach a beginning. The bootstrap paradox says no. Some things in a universe that permits time travel might not have a beginning. Some things might simply be existing in a closed loop of mutual causation, forever sustaining themselves, never having been created, never needing to be. It is the kind of thought that can keep you awake or put you to sleep, depending on whether you find the absence of an origin terrifying or peaceful. A thing that has no beginning has no creator to blame, no first moment to mourn, no origin story to dispute. It simply is. It always was. It always will be. Like a ring with no seam, like a Möbius strip with no edge, like the universe itself, if certain cosmological models are correct, cycling endlessly from expansion to contraction to expansion again, never starting, never stopping, just going. But time is not the only dimension in which the human mind encounters paradox when it looks at the large-scale structure of reality. Space has its own great unanswered question, and it is a question so simple that a child could ask it, and so profound that no physicist alive can answer it. Where is everyone? The question was asked, or at least most famously asked, by the physicist Enrico Fermi over lunch at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the summer of 1950. Fermi, who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on nuclear reactions and who had played a central role in the development of the atomic bomb, was not the sort of man given to idle speculation. He was a calculator, a man who could estimate the number of piano tuners in Chicago or the energy released by an atomic blast with a few scribbles on a napkin, and when he looked up at the sky and considered the numbers told him something that did not make sense. The Milky Way contains roughly 200 billion stars. Many of those stars are similar to the Sunday. A significant fraction of them, as we now know, have planets. The galaxy is roughly 13 billion years old, more than enough time for intelligent life to have evolved, developed technology, and spread across the stars. Even at speeds far below the speed of light, even using technologies no more advanced than what we can currently imagine, a civilization that wanted to colonize the galaxy could do so in a few million years, a blink of an eye on cosmic timescales. The galaxy should be teeming with intelligent life. The evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations should be everywhere, in radio signals, in megastructures, in the chemical signatures of industrial atmospheres, in probes and artifacts, and the unmistakable footprint of technology on the observable universe. And yet we see nothing. No signals, no structures, no visitors. No evidence of any kind that intelligent life exists anywhere other than on this one small planet, orbiting this one ordinary star, in this one unremarkable corner of this one galaxy among 2 trillion. This is the Fermi paradox, and it has haunted astronomers, physicists, and philosophers ever since that lunchtime conversation in 1950. The gap between the expectation that the universe should be full of life and the observation that the universe appears to be empty is so large and so persistent that it demands an explanation, and the explanations that have been proposed range from the mundane to the terrifying. Perhaps intelligent life is simply much rarer than we think. Perhaps the origin of life itself is a fantastically improbable event, a chemical accident so unlikely that it has happened only once in the history of the observable universe, and we are that accident, alone and unrepeatable. Perhaps intelligence is common, but technology is rare. Or technology is common, but interstellar travel is impossible. Or interstellar travel is possible, but no civilization survives long enough to achieve it, destroyed by war or environmental collapse, or some other catastrophe that lies in wait for every species that reaches a certain level of development. This last possibility is known as the Great Filter, and it is the most chilling of all the proposed solutions. The Great Filter hypothesis suggests that somewhere between the origin of life and the colonization of the galaxy, there is a barrier, a step so difficult, so dangerous, so nearly impossible to pass, that almost no civilization makes it through. The question, the terrifying question, is whether the filter is behind us or ahead of us. If it is behind us, if the hard part is something we have already accomplished, perhaps the origin of life itself, or the development of multicellular organisms, or the emergence of intelligence, then we are lucky. We are the exception. We made it through the filter, and the universe is empty because almost no one else did. But if the filter is ahead of us, if the hard part is something we have yet to face, some technological catastrophe or ecological collapse, or existential risk that awaits every civilization that reaches our level of development, then the silence of the universe is not a sign of our good fortune. It is a warning. The sky is empty because everyone who came before us is dead. Fermi did not live to see the full flowering of the paradox that bears his name. He died of stomach cancer in 1954, at the age of 53. A man who had changed the world in ways both luminous and terrible, and who had, over lunch one afternoon, asked a question that the world has been unable to answer ever since. But the paradoxes of time and space and probability are not the only traps the universe sets for thinking creatures. Sometimes the trap is in the act of choosing itself, in the simple everyday business of making a decision, and the most elegant formulation of that trap was devised not by a physicist or a logician, but by a philosopher with a talent for constructing impossible choices. Newcomb's paradox, first described by the physicist William Newcomb in 1960, and later popularized by the philosopher Robert Nozick in 1969, presents you with the following scenario. You are in a room. On a table in front of you are 2 boxes. Box A is transparent, and you can see that it contains $1,000. Box B is opaque, and you cannot see what is inside. You are told that a supremely intelligent being, a predictor, has already made a prediction about what you will do. If the predictor has predicted that you will take only Box B, then Box B contains $1 million. If the predictor has predicted that you will take both boxes, then Box B is empty. The predictor has played this game with thousands of people before and has never been wrong. Every person who took only Box B found $1 million inside. Every person who took both found Box B empty. The predictor's track record is perfect. You have 2 options. You can take only Box B, or you can take both boxes. What do you do? The 2-boxer's argument is straightforward and, on its face, irrefutable. The predictor has already made the prediction, The money is already in the box, or it is not. Nothing you do now can change what is inside box B, because the predictor's decision was made in the past. Taking both boxes is strictly dominant. Regardless of what the predictor predicted, you get more money by taking both. If box B contains 1,000,000, taking both gives you 1,000,000 and 1,000 instead of just 1,000,000. If box B is empty, taking both gives you 1,000 instead of nothing. In every possible scenario, taking both boxes gives you at least as much and potentially more than taking one. The rational choice is obvious. The one-boxer's argument is equally straightforward and on its face, equally irrefutable. The predictor has never been wrong. Every person who took both boxes walked away with $1,000. Every person who took one walked away with 1,000,000. The evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is clear. If you take both boxes, you will get $1,000 because the predictor will have predicted your greed and left box B empty. If you take one box, you will get 1,000,000 because the predictor will have anticipated your restraint and filled box B accordingly. The rational choice is obvious. And so you are stuck. Two principles of rational decision-making, both of them impeccable, both of them time-tested, both of them endorsed by serious thinkers and backed by rigorous arguments, lead to opposite conclusions. The principle of dominance says take both. The principle of expected utility, calibrated to the predictor's perfect track record, says take one. And there is no way to reconcile them, because the paradox is not a puzzle with a hidden solution. It is a genuine conflict between two legitimate modes of reasoning, a crack in the foundations of decision theory that has not been repaired in over half a century. Nozick himself did not know the answer. He presented the paradox without resolving it, inviting readers to choose a side and see what it revealed about their deepest assumptions regarding causation, free will, and the nature of rational choice. The philosophical community split almost exactly down the middle, with roughly equal numbers of one-boxers and two-boxers, each side regarding the other with the kind of bewildered contempt usually reserved for people who hold the toilet paper roll the wrong way round. The paradox endures because it touches something that goes beyond game theory. It asks whether the universe is the kind of place where your choices are truly free, where the future is genuinely open, where what you decide in this moment is not already determined by the configuration of atoms and the laws of physics that were set in motion billions of years before you were born. The two-boxer believes in free will, in the genuine independence of the present from the future, in the ability of the self to act without being predicted. The one-boxer believes in correlation, in the deep connectedness of cause and effect, in the possibility that a sufficiently powerful intelligence could read the architecture of your decision before you have made it. And the fact that both positions are defensible, that the paradox has no solution, is itself the most unsettling conclusion of all. And then there is the final question, the one that waits at the end of every chain of reasoning about the nature of reality, the one that makes all the other paradoxes look like warm-up exercises. It was articulated most sharply by the philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003, and it does not ask whether time travel is possible, or whether aliens exist, or whether you should take one box or two. It asks whether any of this is real. The simulation argument proceeds from three propositions, of which Bostrom argues at least one must be true. First, nearly all civilizations at our level of development go extinct before reaching the technological capacity to run detailed simulations of their ancestors. Second, nearly all civilizations that reach that capacity choose not to run such simulations. Third, we are almost certainly living in a simulation. The logic is disarmingly simple. If civilizations generally survive long enough to develop the computing power necessary to simulate entire universes, complete with conscious beings who believe they are real, and if those civilizations choose to run such simulations, then the number of simulated universes will vastly outnumber the single real universe. For every genuine civilization, there could be billions of simulated copies, each one populated by minds that feel and think and reason and lie awake at night wondering whether they are real. If you are a conscious being, and you do not know whether you are in the real universe or one of the billions of simulated ones, the odds are overwhelmingly against you being real. You are, statistically, almost certainly a simulation. The argument does not prove that we are living in a simulation. It proves that we must accept one of the three propositions, and that if we reject the first two, if we believe that civilizations can and will run ancestor simulations, then we must accept the third. And the third is the one that keeps people awake, not because it is necessarily true, but because it is not obviously false, and because the tools we normally use to determine what is real, observation, measurement, experiment, would produce exactly the same results in a sufficiently detailed simulation as they would in a genuine universe. Bostrom, who directs the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, is careful to note that the argument is not a claim about the current state of technology. We cannot currently simulate anything close to a universe. The argument is about what is possible in principle, about what a civilization with vastly greater computing resources than ours might be able to do, and about what the existence of such a possibility implies for our understanding of where and what we are. The implications, if the simulation hypothesis is correct, are almost too strange to articulate. The laws of physics would not be fundamental truths about the nature of reality. They would be rules, parameters, lines of code written by the simulators and subject, in principle, to revision. The fine-tuning of the physical constants, the seemingly miraculous precision with which the universe is calibrated to permit the existence of stars and planets and chemistry and life, would not require a cosmological explanation. It would require only a programmer, someone who set the values, ran the simulation, and sat back to see what would happen. And the paradoxes themselves, the paradoxes you have been lying here thinking about all night, the frozen arrows and the two-faced ships and the cats that are alive and dead and the hotels that are full and empty, these would not be cracks in reality. They would be features, artifacts, glitches in the code, or Easter eggs left by the designers, or simply the natural consequences of the computational limits of whatever system is running the simulation, the points at which the resolution breaks down and the underlying architecture shows through. It is, in its way, the ultimate paradox, the possibility that everything you experience, everything you know, every thought you have ever had, including the thought you are having right now about whether you are in a simulation, is itself part of the simulation, and that the question of whether you are real is a question that cannot be answered from inside the system. For the same reason that a character in a novel cannot look up from the page and see the author. The night is very quiet now. The paradoxes have stacked themselves up like layers of sediment, each one pressing down on the one below, each one adding a new weight to the question of what is real, what is knowable, what can be trusted. And somewhere beneath all of them, beneath the grandfathers and the predictions and the silent galaxies and the simulated universes, the simplest question of all is still waiting, still unanswered, still pulsing with the same quiet energy it had when you first lay down and closed your eyes. What exactly is going on? What exactly is going on? Not a question anymore, at this hour. More of a murmur, a shape the mind makes when it has been turning things over for too long and the edges of the questions have worn smooth, like stones in a riverbed, like the thoughts that come just before sleep, round and heavy and warm and impossible to grip. The paradoxes have done their work. They have taken the world apart, piece by piece, certainty by certainty, and now, in the quiet that follows the dismantling, in the open space where the solid ground used to be, a different kind of question rises. Not a question about motion, or infinity, or probability, or the structure of space-time. A question about you, about the life you are actually living, the choices you are actually making, the world you actually inhabit when you are not lying in the dark thinking about impossible things. Because the most immediate paradoxes, the ones that press against the skin of daily life, are not the ones that involve electrons or infinite hotels or time machines. They are the ones that involve a supermarket aisle, a plate of food, a ballot box, a god, and the terrible, ordinary, inescapable business of deciding what to do next. Begin with something small. Begin with jam. In the year 2000, two psychologists, Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper, set up a tasting booth in a grocery store in Menlo Park, California. On some days, the booth displayed 6 varieties of jam. On other days, it displayed 24. The researchers watched and counted and measured, and what they found was, on its surface, perfectly mundane, and in its implications, quietly devastating. The large display attracted more people. 60% of shoppers passing by stopped to look at 24 jams, compared to 40% who stopped for 6. More variety drew more attention, which is exactly what you would expect, which is exactly what every marketing department in the world already believed. But when it came to actually buying jam, the pattern reversed. Of those who had seen the display of 30% made a purchase. Of those who had seen the display of 24, only 3% did, 10 times fewer. The abundance of choice had not empowered the shoppers. It had paralyzed them. The paradox of choice, as the psychologist Barry Schwartz would later name it in his 2004 book, is the observation that increasing the number of options available to a person does not increase their satisfaction, but decreases it. More choices lead to more anxiety, more regret, more second-guessing, more of the corrosive feeling that whatever you chose, you probably should have chosen something else. The freedom to choose, which Western liberal democracies have elevated to something close to a sacred value, turns out, when taken to excess, to be a burden rather than a gift, a weight that presses down on every decision and makes the simple act of selecting a jar of strawberry preserves feel like a referendum on the kind of person you are. Schwartz distinguished between 2 types of people: satisficers, who choose the first option that meets their criteria and move on, and maximizers, who insist on examining every available option to ensure they have selected the best one. Maximizers, he found, consistently achieved objectively better outcomes than satisficers. They got the higher-paying job, the better apartment, the jam with the most favorable ratio of fruit to sugar, and they were consistently less happy. The maximizer's curse is that the exhaustive search, the compulsive comparison, the relentless optimization destroys the pleasure of the result. You cannot enjoy what you have if you are always wondering about what you might have had. And in a world that offers more options than any previous civilization has ever confronted, from the 40 varieties of toothpaste on the pharmacy shelf to the thousands of potential partners on a dating app, the maximizer is not a rare personality type. The maximizer is the default setting of modern consumer culture, and the anxiety that follows is not a malfunction, it is a feature. The paradox is not that choice is bad. Choice is good. The ability to choose is a fundamental component of human dignity and autonomy, and a prerequisite for anything that deserves to be called freedom. The paradox is that more choice is not always more good, that the relationship between options and well-being is not linear but curved, rising at first and then, past a certain point, falling, declining into a fog of indecision and regret, and the paralysis of the grocery aisle, standing in front of 24 jams and buying none of them. But the paralysis of choice is not a modern invention. It is not a product of capitalism or consumerism or the proliferation of supermarket brands. It is as old as philosophy itself, and its purest, most distilled expression comes from a thought experiment attributed, almost certainly incorrectly, to a 14th century French philosopher named Jean Buridan. Buridan's ass is a donkey standing exactly midway between two identical bales of hay. The bales are the same size, the same quality, the same distance away. The donkey is hungry. It wants to eat. But it has no reason to choose one bale over the other, because the bales are identical and a rational agent. An agent that chooses on the basis of reasons cannot choose between two options when there is no reason to prefer one to the other. And so the donkey, paralyzed by perfect symmetry, unable to move left because right is equally good, and unable to move right because left is equally good, stands in the middle and starves to death. The thought experiment is sometimes treated as a joke, as a reductio ad absurdum of a particular theory of rational action, a demonstration that pure reason, uncontaminated by desire or impulse, or the simple animal urge to eat the closest thing, leads to paralysis and death. And perhaps it is a joke of a sort. But the joke has teeth, because the question it raises, the question of how a rational being can choose between equal options, is not trivial, and the answers that have been offered are not entirely satisfying. One answer is that in practice, no two options are ever truly identical. The bales of hay differ in some respect, however slight, even if only in their position relative to the donkey's left and right eyes, and this microscopic asymmetry provides the reason for choice. But this answer evades, rather than solves the problem, because the thought experiment is asking about a principle, about what rationality demands when options are genuinely equal, and deferring to minor asymmetries is an admission that rationality alone cannot break the tie. Another answer, and the more interesting one, is that rational choice does not require a reason. That choosing arbitrarily, flipping a coin, going left because left is the direction your head happened to be facing, is itself a rational strategy when the alternatives are equal, because the cost of not choosing, starvation, is greater than the cost of choosing without a reason. This is the answer that most people find intuitive, and it is almost certainly what you or I or any real donkey would do. But it is worth pausing to notice what this answer concedes: that rationality, the great engine of human achievement, the tool that built cities and cured diseases and sent machines to the outer reaches of the solar system, sometimes has nothing to say. Sometimes the best it can offer is a shrug. Sometimes the right choice is no choice at all, a surrender to randomness, a coin toss in the dark, a step taken not because reason demands it, but because standing still is worse. And there is something oddly comforting about that, at this hour in this darkness. The idea that you do not always need a reason, that the gap between two equal options is not a void to be feared, but a space to be crossed, quickly and without ceremony, so that you can get on with the business of eating or sleeping or living, or whatever it is that the next moment requires. But not all paradoxes are about choices between equal things. Some are about choices between things that cannot coexist, about attributes that seem individually possible but collectively impossible, about a being so powerful that its own power becomes its limitation. And the oldest of these, the one that has haunted theology and philosophy for longer than almost any other question, begins with a single word: God. Can God create a stone so heavy that even God cannot lift it? The question is usually presented as a riddle, a clever trick designed to embarrass the devout or amuse the skeptical. But it is considerably more than that. It is a paradox about the concept of omnipotence, about what it means to say that a being can do anything, and about whether the phrase "can do anything" is itself coherent. If God can create such a stone, then there is something God cannot do. Lift the stone. If God cannot create such a stone, then there is something God cannot do. Create it. Either way, God's power has a limit. Either way, omnipotence, defined as the ability to do literally anything, collapses under the weight of its own logic. The concept contains a contradiction, not because God is flawed, but because the concept is, because the idea of a being that can do anything includes the ability to create situations that the being cannot resolve, and a being that can create irresolvable situations is a being that cannot resolve all situations, which means it cannot do everything, which means it is not omnipotent. Theologians have responded to this in various ways. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century Dominican friar, whose Summa Theologica remains one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in human history, argued that omnipotence does not mean the ability to do literally anything. It means the ability to do anything that is logically possible. God cannot create a married bachelor, not because God lacks power, but because a married bachelor is a contradiction in terms, a combination of words that does not describe a coherent state of affairs. Similarly, a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift is a contradiction. If the being is omnipotent, no stone is too heavy. The phrase too heavy for omnipotence to lift is meaningless, like the phrase north of the North Pole. God's inability to do the logically impossible is not a limitation on God's power. It is a limitation on language's ability to describe coherent tasks. This is an elegant solution, and most contemporary theologians and philosophers of religion accept some version of it. But it comes at a cost, because it redefines omnipotence in a way that makes it considerably less impressive than the word initially suggests. An omnipotent being that can only do logically possible things is a being constrained by logic, and a being constrained by anything, even logic, is a being that is not, in the naive and powerful sense that most people mean when they use the word truly all-powerful. The omnipotence paradox does not disprove God, but it does suggest that the concept of unlimited power is like the concept of a largest number or a set of all sets, a concept that the human mind can form, but that reality, or at least logic, cannot contain. And from the question of what God can do arises inevitably the question of what God has done, or more precisely the question of what God has allowed. Because if God is omnipotent, able to do anything that is logically possible, and omnibenevolent, perfectly and infinitely good, and omniscient, knowing everything that has happened and everything that will happen, then why does evil exist? Why do children die of disease? Why do earthquakes swallow cities? Why does cruelty flourish and kindness suffer, and the world, for all its beauty, remain a place in which terrible, senseless, undeserved suffering is a daily occurrence? This is the problem of evil, and it is the oldest and most formidable challenge to theistic belief, a paradox that has been articulated by philosophers from Epicurus in the 3rd century BC to David Hume in the 18th century, to contemporary philosophers of religion who have devoted entire careers to its analysis. Epicurus put it with characteristic concision. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? The responses, collectively known as theodicies, are many and varied, and none of them has been universally accepted. The free will defense, most associated with the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, argues that God gave human beings free will, and that free will necessarily includes the freedom to do evil, and that a world with free will and the possibility of evil is better than a world without free will and the certainty of goodness. This accounts for moral evil, for the cruelty that human beings inflict on one another, But it does not account for natural evil, for the earthquake and the cancer and the tidal wave, for the suffering that has no human author and no discernible purpose. The soul-making theodicy, associated with the theologian John Hick, argues that suffering is necessary for moral and spiritual growth, that a world without pain would be a world without courage, without compassion, without the virtues that can only develop in response to adversity. This has a certain appeal in the abstract, but it becomes considerably harder to maintain when applied to specific cases, to the child born with a painful and terminal illness, to the victim of a natural disaster who had no time to grow or learn or become anything other than dead. The scale and distribution of suffering in the world do not obviously correspond to the needs of soul-making, and the claim that they do requires either a cosmic perspective that no human being possesses, or a faith that the patterns, invisible from down here, make sense from above. And then there are those who simply accept the paradox, who hold all three attributes, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, omniscience, as articles of faith and acknowledge that the existence of evil is a mystery, not a refutation. Mystery, in this tradition, is not a failure of reasoning, but a recognition of the limits of human understanding, a statement that the universe is larger than the mind that inhabits it, and that some questions, the deepest questions, the questions that press against the boundary between the finite and the infinite, may not have answers that a finite being can comprehend. This is not an argument, it is a posture. But it is a posture that billions of people have adopted across thousands of years, in the face of suffering that would otherwise be unbearable, and its persistence, if nothing else, testifies to the depth of the need it addresses. The problem of evil is the paradox that you feel rather than solve, the one that lives not in the intellect but in the chest, in the place where grief and outrage and confusion press against each other and produce a pressure that has no outlet. It is the question you ask at a funeral, or in a hospital corridor, or in the silence after a news broadcast, or in the dark late at night, when the mind has exhausted its capacity for abstraction and is left with nothing but the raw, untheorized fact that the world contains both immeasurable beauty and immeasurable pain, and that no system of thought, no philosophy, no theology, no paradox has ever been able to explain why. But there is one final paradox, and it belongs not to the realm of gods and absolutes, but to the realm of human societies, to the practical, urgent, deeply contested question of how people should live together. It was articulated by the philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, in his book The Open Society and Its Enemies, and it remains one of the most relevant and most frequently invoked paradoxes in contemporary political thought. The paradox of tolerance states that if a society is tolerant without limit, if it extends tolerance to those who are themselves intolerant, then the tolerant will eventually be destroyed, and tolerance with them. Unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance. A society that tolerates intolerance gives intolerance the space to grow, to organize, to gain power, and eventually to suppress the very tolerance that allowed it to flourish. The tolerant society, by being true to its own principles, creates the conditions for its own destruction. Popper was writing in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, having fled his native Austria after the rise of fascism, and his analysis was not abstract. He had seen, with the clarity of a man who had been forced from his home by an ideology that exploited the openness of democratic society to seize power and dismantle the institutions that had allowed it to exist, exactly what happens when tolerance is extended unconditionally. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government of Germany that preceded the Nazi regime, had tolerated the Nazi Party, had allowed it to organize, to campaign, to stand for election, to use the mechanisms of democracy to undermine democracy itself. Tolerance had been weaponized, and the weapon had been turned against the hand that held it. Popper's conclusion was not that tolerance should be abandoned. He was, to his core, a defender of the open society, of free inquiry, of the right to dissent, of the fundamental value of allowing people to live and think and speak as they choose. His conclusion was that tolerance must have limits, that a tolerant society must reserve the right to be intolerant of intolerance, that the defense of openness sometimes requires the exercise of closure. This is not hypocrisy, it is self-preservation. A tolerant society that refuses to act against those who seek to destroy it is not being principled, it is being naive. The paradox is that the line is impossible to draw cleanly. At what point does an unpopular opinion become an intolerable ideology? Who decides? By what criteria? And what prevents the machinery of suppression, once activated, from being turned against legitimate dissent, against minority views, against the uncomfortable and the heterodox, and the merely unfashionable? The history of censorship is a history of overreach, of powers granted for one purpose being used for another, of the boundary between the intolerable and the merely offensive being drawn by the powerful in the interest of the powerful. Popper knew this. He was not naive about the risks. But he also knew what happened when the risk was not taken, when the intolerant were given unlimited freedom to organize and to act, and the knowledge sat heavy in his work, as it sits heavy in our own time. When the paradox of tolerance is invoked daily in arguments about speech, about platforms, about the limits of permissible discourse in societies that define themselves by their openness, it is the paradox that will not go away, because the conditions that produce it will not go away, because any society that values freedom will face, again and again, the question of how much freedom to extend to those who would abolish it. And the answer, whatever it is, will always be a compromise, a best guess, a line drawn in sand that shifts with the tide. And the drawing of the line will always feel like a betrayal of the principle it is trying to protect. And so the paradoxes arrive at the shore of sleep. All of them, the old ones and the new ones, the mathematical and the physical, and the moral and the theological, the ones about arrows and donkeys and doors and jars of jam, the ones about gods who cannot lift their own stones and societies that cannot survive their own principles, and men who cannot cross their own rooms. They arrive, and they settle, and they find their places in the dark, like the notes of a song you have been listening to for hours. A song that began with a man standing on one side of a room and wondering whether he could reach the other. He could. He always could. The tortoise was always going to lose the race. The arrow was always going to reach its target. The room was always crossable, the door always reachable, the distance always finite, no matter how many times you halved it. The paradoxes were never about proving that the world does not work. They were about proving that our understanding of the world has holes in it, beautiful, precise, elegant holes, shaped exactly like the things we do not yet know. And perhaps that is the gift they offer, at this hour, to a mind that is finally letting go. Not answers. Paradoxes do not give answers. They give questions, and the questions held gently, without the need to solve them, without the urgency of the daytime, without the demand that everything makes sense right now, this minute. Before you are allowed to rest, the questions become something else. They become a kind of music, a rhythm, a pattern that repeats and varies and repeats, like breathing, like a heartbeat, like the slow, reliable, deeply mysterious process by which a conscious mind dissolves into sleep and reassembles itself in the morning. The same mind and not the same mind, the ship in the harbor and the ship in the warehouse, both and neither, always and never, true and false, and something in between that has no name but feels in the last moments before the lights go out, like the only honest answer there is. The room is dark, the questions are quiet. The tortoise, at long last, crosses the finish line. And you, lying here in the infinite hotel of the night, in the room that is yours and not yours, in the body that is you and not you, in the moment that is now and was always now and will never be now again, you close your eyes, and the paradox of sleep takes you. the one that no philosopher has ever solved, the one that asks how a mind that is trying to fall asleep can ever succeed, since the effort of trying is the very thing that keeps it awake, and the only way to sleep is to stop trying. But stopping trying is itself a kind of trying, a deliberate act of surrender that is not quite surrender because you chose it. The loop is familiar, the loop is old, and the loop, mercifully, has an answer that logic cannot provide, but the body can, because the body does not care about paradoxes, does not care about contradictions, does not care whether the arrow moves or the cat lives or the hotel has room. The body just breathes, and breathes, and breathes. And somewhere between one breath and the next, in the space that has no thickness, in the moment that has no duration, in the gap that the philosophers have been arguing about for 25 centuries and that you have been drifting toward all night, you are gone, not gone, here, not here, asleep. The oldest paradox, the kindest one, the one that proves every single night that the thing you cannot explain is the thing you can always do.